slides, hopefully. Yeah, so this is the LinkML, the Linked Data Modeling Framework tutorial at ISMB in July 2024. You can find these slides, and I would definitely suggest that you do find these slides at that bit.ly link, or if you want to scan the QR code, that would be great too. There's a lot of links in these slides and a lot of different like Git commands that you might want to just copy and paste as we're going through this. And so, you know, if you can get into these slides, it's a good resource. We do have a LinkML drive for this workshop. There'll be, you know, anything that we generate here will be in that drive, and you should have access to it. Of course, these slides. What we're going to try to do today is just walk through making a new LinkML schema project. And that will involve learning some of the basics of the modeling language itself and understanding how to validate data according to a schema, as well as sort of lint, or, you know, make sure you're following the best practices of your schema, how you're developing that. And then look at some of the features that LinkML offers in terms of code and documentation generation via a few command line tools. And then hopefully by the end, we'll have you all set up on GitHub with a deployment of our tutorial to your own GitHub Pages account. We'll cross our fingers and hope we can get there. I think we can. Since it's such a small group of us, of course, just ask if you have any questions, we'll stop. It's okay to interrupt any of us. We also have this Google Doc for questions and answers in case, you know, your question is more in depth than we have time to go through. We'll also have a person, Mark, he's here on the right, monitoring that Google Doc, answering when he can, you know, converting that Google Doc into a FAQ for our tool. So it's a nice place to add longer questions if you have them. My name is Sierra, as I said. I'm a longtime software developer. My two colleagues, Patrick and Kevin, are also longtime software developers. We've been working to support science as software developers for many years now through a variety of different projects. We all are LinkML developers, but each of us has more of a focus on one part of the toolkit than others. And so we'll try to keep to the answering questions to the expertise that we have. We have a large online community for LinkML, a lot of open source developers. We have a Slack channel and you know, a Google group and all sorts of stuff that's pretty active. So if you have interest in joining us, we'd love to have you. And you know, I can invite you to more of these kinds of meetings where we do tutorials and hear from the community once a month. But just a big thank you to all the people that have put time and effort into LinkML in really a non-funded open source way. And we hope that some of you will join us as well after this. Just as a matter of course, we try to follow code of conduct at LinkML. We're welcoming, we use inclusive language, we're, you know, respectful of different viewpoints, and definitely accept constructive criticism. We love feedback and we love to make our tool better. And so just pointing out the code of conduct and hoping that everyone else can abide by that in this tutorial as well. So this is what our schedule looks like. I'll give a brief introduction to the toolkit and framework. We'll set up a LinkML repository. Hopefully everyone can follow along. We'll walk through some of the very common LinkML model components and show you how they're used and how to write metadata for your schema. Have a little break, continue with some more modeling, talking about ontology integration with enumerations and mapping to other models that exist in the world. Go through a tutorial on how to lint your schema, including, you know, following best practices that we found over the last couple of years of real, you know, testing the tires of this framework. We've come to some conclusions about what we think are best practices for authoring a schema, even though LinkML is very permissive when it comes to syntax. And then we will show you how to generate code from your model, whether that be JSON schema or Pydantic or even our full documentation site. Have another break, validate some test data that we put together, and then, you know, of course, wrap up, answer any questions, etc. We did send out a few prerequisites for this tutorial, especially if you want to follow along. These things are nice to have. You know, GitHub account where we can deploy your documentation, Python 3.9 or higher. LinkML is grounded in Python, right? So all of our tools are developed in Python. That's That's our language of choice. And then pipx for helping to solve the never-ending challenges of making a Python environment. It will help here. And another slide you'll see often throughout the day are these rest stops. We hope you follow along with us and we build up our project. We hope you can do that on your own command line. But if you get lost or we're going too fast, which is definitely my challenge here, you can always clone our repo, and we have tags in that repo that you can check out. So after Patrick talks about how to create a project with our cookie cutter, if you get behind, you can always check out the tag that he's created that is the result of the entirety of that section. So they're all linked here again with those slides. I can put up the link in the chat. I'll put up the link in the chat to these slides as well as we go. So I think, anybody have any questions to start? Hi, David. Nice to see you.
Should we be starting from Git cloning that repo or from a bare repo, or will that come later?
I think you should just start with just a command line, and we'll try to get you through walking through the cookie cutter so you don't have to clone this.
Awesome. Thanks.
And let me put in the chat really quick a link to these slides. And again, those have lots of links in them. Okay, so I'm Sierra. We sort of said that already. So I guess I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to LinkML. And I think a lot of people on the call already know that we're in a field where our data is really complex. We don't have simple data that doesn't change very often. In fact, whether you're looking at a cell like this in the beginning, in the middle of the slide here, where you're talking about the functions of a gene or its relation to other genes within a particular cellular structure, to higher level biology, comparing genetic effects on different organisms, to even higher biology, maybe is one way to say it, clinical models of patient care, or even in the environment itself, right? You're looking at data that is quite complex, has lots of different components. It's never shaped like a cube here, and it unfortunately it's most of our knowledge is still in text formats, in papers, in spreadsheets, in other ways, in other formats that aren't computable. And so, what we often see from our data is that we get really incomplete metadata along with our data sets. We might have, a decreased use of global identifiers. They're not consistent. They have no sort of like longevity. We might not have standardized variables in the headers of our spreadsheets. We have a lot of free text information. And sometimes we have these wide, sparse tables with hundreds of variables that may or may not be null on purpose, right? We can never tell if null is because somebody forgot to fill in a component, or if it's validly null because we're talking about a particular kind of sample or a particular kind of data, or whether it's just null because something else is complete. And this is actually a depth field from one of the projects we work on. The National Microbiome Data Collaborative is a group that is trying to sort of synchronize and harmonize metadata around microbiome data collection in the biological sciences. And they'll have sample data come in with depth fields, a depth column that has all these different kinds of values in it, and it's our job to sort of harmonize that. And I think this is pretty common. Everyone who works in biological data knows this. And so, we can do better, right? We can have two different pathways to make this better. One, we can start with shared standards and reuse and contribute to those efforts when possible. Like, we should not be recreating the wheel for a lot of these different kinds of standards and models and vocabularies and definitions of our objects. We should try to use ones that already exist and contribute to it when our expertise dictates that, make the source better. And then the other thing we can do, the other half of that, is to take these sort of implicit models, or what I'm calling implicit models, where someone has an idea of what the data is when they're collecting it, and translate those into explicit models, where we can actually see from the data itself in a computable way how to take that data and reuse it. And I sort of introduced myself at the beginning. I'm a software developer. I'm not a biologist. And so all of these examples, please give me a little grace. They're just me coming up with things on the fly here. But I think the best way to sort of examine this space is to really look at some examples. And these are 3 example data sets from Oregon. This is the state I live in the United States. One is from Lake Albert, one is from the Pacific Ocean, and one is from Crater Lake. And there's some sneaky stuff with these different biomes in Oregon. One I'll tell you is that Lake Albert is actually a saltwater inland lake. And Crater Lake is a freshwater lake. It's actually the deepest lake in Oregon. And of course, the Pacific Ocean is the Pacific Ocean. And so if I had these 3 independent researchers trying to find out about the microbiome composition of these different bodies of water in Oregon, that's great. They might collect it all in different ways. And we might have a 4th researcher come along and really want to look at that epipelagic region of the sample data sets. Like you might really want to see just where the sunlight penetrates these water samples. And what they have when they come along is really a diversity of data to work with. And so the first thing that researcher might have to do is pull out from these titles of our sample data sets the actual type of sample that they're looking at, so that they can compare across the data sample types. And so one of the things we think about when we're aggregators is like, how do I define whether or not something is a lake or an ocean? And is my definition of a lake the same as your definition of a lake? Can a puddle be a lake? Can a ephemeral pool be a lake? Does a lake have to have a certain size? Is it freshwater? Is it saltwater? And all of those things that we're thinking about aren't necessarily something that we're thinking about from scratch, right? A lot of people think about these things. A lot of people combine their knowledge to make ontologies, right? To make controlled vocabulary data sets that are hierarchically related, that define these different concepts. And so in fact, like our researchers, if they were aware of these, could know that the ENVO, the environmental ontology, does define what a lake is. It tells in specifically whether or not that lake is, a marine water body, a saltwater body, a non-saltwater body. It defines the shape and size of lakes. So we could reuse those definitions taken from people who know about lakes, the experts, and really annotate our data with a controlled vocabulary of identifiers that stick around forever, that have reusable definitions, and that allow us to interoperate with other data sets also using those ontologies. So a very easy thing to add here is just an annotation of the type of our sample with an ontology term. And in fact, we see that, marine photic zone, the epipelagic layer, is actually recorded in the ontology as well. So we could see even more specifically than whether or not it was saltwater or freshwater, we could see that it's also at the top of a water column. And in fact, our colleagues at the National Microbiome Data Collaborative have done just this. They annotate a lot of their data with ENVO, the environmental ontology, but also bring in together a couple of other standards, the MICSES, minimal information about a sequence standard, and the GOLD ecosystem classification. So we have a lot of interoperability and reuse going on with just these ontology annotations in our metadata. I can compare a heck of a lot of data already. For example, in other domains, the human phenotype ontology, for example, uses the chemical and biological entity ontology, or CHEBI, and the cell ontology as well. So we can combine these standards together and really do a good job of annotating our data with ontologies. But that's maybe not enough, right? So we've tagged our data in this example with a particular environment ontology term, but unfortunately, we still have to harmonize, the rest of these fields in this implicit data set. We should really be looking at depth here and trying to do a better job of making this computable. Really, these are models, these are schemas hiding in plain sight, right? And the only way we can compute over them or compare them or aggregate them is with a human getting involved. And in fact, not only is it just, it's not really just that we're in a spreadsheet and people can enter, data in a non-clean way in a spreadsheet or whatever. There's not a lot of validation in a spreadsheet, but it's not just that, right? We can have really stable existing frameworks like SQL for making our data models here, and still we'll have the same problem of not being able to interoperate. In this example, I have a sample table with an environment, and it has a varchar here. So I'm saying, well, this must be a string value. And over here in this other sample, the Crater Lake sample, I'm giving an idea of where the environment is actually a foreign key. You can imagine this sample might have a relationship to an ontology term table or something, while this one is just collecting strings. And if you think I'm just making it up, it's I'm totally not, right? This is the Alliance of Genome Resources, where 4 or 5 different model organism databases are trying to come together and make a single schema for their data. And this is, each of them trying to describe with SQL the definition of a genotype. And you can tell right away that they're not the same. And we have to, even though they're conceptually the same, they're not computably the same. And so,
question.
yeah, go ahead.
I missed the beginning because I had a hard time to connect. With the are we expected to wait at certain times to ask question, or can we throw them in as we go?
Oh no, please, you did great. Like just interrupt at any time. That's totally fine. And if we need to move on, I will certainly move us along. But yes, please ask questions whenever you'd like.
Okay, thanks. So like, I'm just wondering why you're showing this example of like SQL tables, basically where like I guess it doesn't really matter whether the Pacific Ocean sample, the Pacific Ocean group versus the Crater Lake group store their data in one way or another, where what really matters is the way that they're gonna build these interoperable objects to exchange information, right?
Definitely. I mean, good point. Like people can store their data however they want. My point with this slide is really to say that sometimes when you see data being presented to you as a researcher in the biological space, what you get is maybe a schema definition. You might get the Pacific Ocean sample schema, and you might get the Crater Lake sample data in SQL. You might get it through schema view or something like that. And it's still on you as the researcher that wants to combine these to figure out what someone means by environment here versus environment there. So if I want to bring this together, I still am not interoperable, even though they're both in the same technological language, even though they're both SQL, even though I can use the same tools on that SQL database, I can't, there's still a human involved to harmonize that data. Great question. All right. So what we think is that LinkML helps us solve this, and we'll get into it. But LinkML is a two-part toolkit and framework. One, it has a meta model that defines the elements and the metadata components that you can use to annotate a schema using LinkML. And on the other side of the framework or toolkit are a set of tools that you can use once your data or once your schema is in LinkML to do a lot of interesting things like validate your data, convert your data between different forms. Say I got it in JSON and I want it in TSV, or I got it in TSV and I want it in JSON. Also, maybe there are tools that you can do data entry with. So we have a tool called Data Harmonizer that takes a LinkML model under the hood and it spins up sort of like an online user interface that makes the data entry conformant with a schema. We can also do inference on our data, and we can generate code from our models. So LinkML has the meta model and the toolkit. And what we're going to see today is how you take some of these implicit models and turn them using the LinkML syntax into a computable model that builds in RDF and semantic web technologies under the hood in a simple way that doesn't make everyone learn how to do OWL, although we very much encourage people to do OWL and learn Sparkle and all those great tools that exist for the semantic web. LinkML has a lot of features in it that maybe some of these other more standard modeling languages don't. You can import a LinkML model from another LinkML model. So if I want to reuse your little tiny component model, I can do that with a simple import. I can specify classes more specifically in a hierarchy, and I'll show you all of this. There's some nice links here to an online tutorial as well, and of course documentation. The other good, nice part of LinkML is that you can use it as a converter box. So if you have a complicated application, right, and you might have a SQL database in the background, and you might have an API that sits in the middle, and at the end you might have some JavaScript or TypeScript or something that displays a web page. You can actually use LinkML in all of those different technical stacks using a converter. So I can take my LinkML model and make it into SQL data definition language. I can make it into a Pydantic data class representation to use with a fast API implementation, and I can generate TypeScript from my model as well. So it kind of helps you keep that language that you're using throughout your organization the same. We'll talk a little bit more about the validators. I won't go into this in too much depth, but you can use a LinkML schema to validate your data, and you can generate LinkML from existing models. So you could take a JSON schema model, run it through our converters, and it would spit out LinkML YAML. I think one of the most underappreciated things about LinkML and underappreciated things in general is that we need to create documentation for our models. We need people to have easy access to what we're talking about. One of the most important things about creating a data model or a standard of any kind is community buy-in, right? We want people to use the same model. We don't want to use lots of different models. And I think one thing LinkML does a great job is generating documentation from annotations on the schema itself. So you keep your documentation close to your code, but you can also display it for a user in a more general way. So, done talking. That's sort of the pitch. And now let's see how it works. And I just wanted to remind everybody about the rest stops. So we are on step 0, the basic project creation. And I think I'm going to stop sharing here and hand it over to my colleague, Patrick.
Yes, thank you, Sierra. And I will share. Okay. So this is kind of where the hands-on part of the tutorial really starts. So we hope you'll follow along as we do this. So this first part is going to be setting up a LinkML project. Now, there are a couple of different ways to author LinkML schemas, and the baseline, like the way, is to just write your schema as YAML, and that's what we're going to do in this tutorial. But it's not the only way. So I'll just point out very quickly that like a couple other options just to keep in the back of your mind, once you leave this tutorial, is that there is a tool called Schema Sheets that takes a spreadsheet format and can generate the YAML version of the LinkML schema from it. And then Sierra already briefly mentioned, but yeah, there are tools to take what we kind of refer to as semi-structured sources, run it through this schema automator tool, and again, the output is LinkML YAML. So the YAML is really like the baseline, and that's what we're going to stick with throughout this tutorial. But like I said, there's a few other options out there. And then as far as schema development goes, we've through our time like authoring our own LinkML schemas, because not only do we develop the LinkML tools, but we write these schemas ourselves. And so we've kind of developed some best practices over the years. And so we've kind of encoded that into this project cookie cutter repository. And so that's what's going to help us like bootstrap our project here today. And so it has a lot of this. It has a lot of this good stuff like licensing and Git initialization and that kind of stuff just set up out of the box for you. And so here's the basic overview of what we're going to do with the cookie cutter, and what we're going to do in this section of the tutorial here. First, we got to make sure we have like the right tools installed. This is kind of like a one-time setup, and then we're going to create and set up our project, and then just have to talk very briefly about virtual environments. This is a Python thing. So if you're familiar with the world of Python, you might already know about this. If not, this might be new to you, but we just kind of got to, and we could talk all day about Python virtual environments, but we'll just talk very briefly. But if for example, you've got a project over here that uses one version of LinkML and like some other dependencies, you've got another one over here, maybe it's using a slightly different version of LinkML, it's got its own dependencies. We need to keep these things like separate and not like interfering with each other. And so that's where virtual environments come into play. We draw a little boundary around these these different projects, and we call them virtual environments. And so generally each project you work on is going to have its own virtual environment. There's many ways to like make and manage virtual environments in the Python ecosystem. Some might say too many, but the tool that the LinkML like development team has kind of embraced is a tool called Poetry. So Poetry is the tool that we're going to use to create and interact with our virtual environments. So throughout the rest of this tutorial, you're going to see a lot of like Poetry run type commands. And so that's what's happening there. It's just a way to interact with a Python virtual environment. so yeah, so here we go. So this is where we're really going to get started now. So first, is poetry similar to Conda? Yes, they do kind of solve similar problems. There is overlap anyway between poetry and Conda. Not exactly the same. Okay, so first, let's see if we've already got poetry. Poetry installed. So I happen to have poetry installed already. If you don't, if you try poetry -- version on your command line and you get a command not found, we recommend installing poetry using pipx. Pipx is a modern sort of Python tool for installing Python-based command line applications. So hopefully you already have pipx installed. That was something we kind of sent out instructions for ahead of time. But if not, there are some nice instructions here at the pipx documentation. Okay, yeah. So if you're familiar with Conda, if you kind of already know what you're doing with that, you're more than welcome to. But yeah. So I'll take a pause here and just make sure everybody's caught up. Is everybody hopefully at a place where they now have poetry installed?
Installing right now, but so I have a first question. So like what we're trying to do now with the section 0 from the plan, I think, is to set up a GitHub repo that will publish our LinkML schema that others will be able to find to understand the way we're organizing the data, right?
That's right. Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, we're setting up sort of an environment and a project, you know, files and folders and all that for developing a LinkML schema.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to move forward here and start talking about Cruft a little bit. So Cruft is another Python-based command line tool that can be used to take what's referred to as a cookie cutter, sort of a template repository, and customize it through some you know, interactive questions, and then, you know, produce a project for you. If you've used the cookie cutter package before, you kind of already know what Cruft does. Cruft just adds a little bit more on top of cookie cutter. The differences aren't, if that doesn't make any sense to you, that's fine. The differences aren't that interesting or relevant here. But the first thing I'm going to do is also check by running Cruft help to see if I already have Cruft installed, and I do. If you don't, Cruft is another thing that is pipx installable. So the goal here is by the end of this step, hopefully you're able to run Cruft -- help and see that it is installed.
So I understand that Cruft is like cookie cutter, but I missed what cookie cutter does.
Okay, yeah. So cookie cutter kind of, you can point it to sort of a specially formatted repository, and cookie cutter knows how to sort of take the contents of that repository. It'll ask you questions like, what do you want to name this thing? Like, what's your name? You know, it asks you questions, and then based on your answers, kind of plug in like little holes, little, you know, it's like the cookie cutter itself provides a kind of a template with some information for you to fill in. So then cookie cutter is taking the contents of that, plugging in your answers, and then kind of spitting out the results onto your file system.
Got it. Thank you. Sorry, I don't want to slow down things too much, but like I have another question. So
Yeah.
I installed stuff with pipx, and it works to install, but yet they're not available from the command line yet. I mean, I can also install them with apt-get, but like through pipx, it seems if I don't if I install it through pipx, it's not available.
Oh, interesting. Okay. There may be. Let me look real quick here. You may try running. I'll put it in the chat here. It's a command pipx ensure path, and if you also just installed pipx for the first time, you may also need to maybe close and restart your terminal to like resource your environment.
Okay, yeah, no, I did that. But,
okay.
Although yeah, okay. It says success added whatever folder to the path environment variable. So let's see. Okay, I'll continue investigating that as you go. It doesn't work for me yet.
Okay. All right. I can loop back to you after the we get through a couple more steps and see how you're doing that. And the last thing in terms of prerequisites is that our sort of initial project setup is going to involve making it automated or setting up a Git repository for our project, and also making an initial commit to that Git repository. And so if you've never worked with Git on your system before, you might need to do some configuration first. So you might want to just check first if your name and email address and default branch are set. So I'm gonna, let's see here, git config global user name. Okay, so I have configured this. If you've ever worked with a Git repository before, you've probably already done this. Yep, that's me. All right. So, but if you haven't, you can use these commands to configure that. Okay. And moving on. Okay, and so finally, this is where we're going to start setting up our project. So we'll start from the directory where we want our new project directory to live. So I'm in a little bit of a I'm in my work directory here, and so this command is going to create a new project directory within this one. And the command is here. So cruft create, and then the URL of the cookie cutter repository. So when I run that, here's where it's going to start asking me some questions. So for let's see, project name, I want to use LinkML tutorial 2024. GitHub org. I don't know why it's phrased like like this, to be honest. GitHub username or organization. So I'm going to use my work one here. A project description. ISMB 2024. Full name. Email address. And then the last few are so these first 5 are kind of like the most important ones. The last ones you can kind of flip through kind of quickly. It's asking about a license. We'll just accept the first one. It's going to generate an initial like very basic, almost like kind of like a hello world like model using this person class. That's fine. We're gonna clobber that later, but for now we'll just accept it. Do you want to create Python classes? Yes, that's fine. I mentioned at the beginning that there's a way to create a LinkML model based on spreadsheets, and it's asking if I want to use that. And the default is no, so I'm going to accept that. I don't, even though I already said no, it always still asks like, what's your sheet ID? So just accept that. It's not going to be used for anything. Same with this Google Sheet tabs thing. And then this is a bit of customization around how your documentation gets deployed on GitHub Pages. Again, just accepting the default is fine. Okay, so it's taken all of my answers and it has made this LinkML tutorial 2024 directory. And so I can cd into that directory. Well, it's made all this these nice files for me. For instance, what did I say? I said I wanted an MIT license. So yeah, there it is. Okay. Back to the slides here. So yeah, so again, here's the command if you need to copy and paste that. And then the last thing to do is run this make setup command. What this is going to do is this is actually going to set up the virtual environment, install all the dependencies. It's going to do a basic generation of some artifacts from your schema, including documentation. And then the last thing it's going to do is initialize or do the first commit to the Git repository. So the last thing to do is make setup. So you can see it did get a init on this thing. Now it's doing a poetry install, installing a bunch of dependencies. And the last thing it did was it made a commit, an initial commit with all of the files that were generated from the cookie cutter. Okay, I'll pause here. Are people kind of following along? Any questions or anything? Okay, we'll keep going then. So the last thing I want to do is I'm going to put this on GitHub. You don't have to do this, but it's, if you have a GitHub account, if you want to, push your repository up, this will help with later on when we see things about like generating and publishing documentation. So I'm going to go to github.com/new. I'm going to say LinkML tutorial 2024 for the repository name. We can work locally now. Yeah, you absolutely. Yes, you definitely can. Public repository. I don't want to add anything to it. I just want a bare repository. Okay, and then since we already have an existing local repository, I just need to run these commands here. So I'm adding this as a remote named origin to this repository. My branch is already named main, so I don't need to do that. That's just making sure that the branch name on GitHub and locally are the same, but I already know that's true for me. And the last thing is to push my repository up. Okay, and then if I refresh this page, okay, great. There's all my files. It's actually already running a GitHub action, which we'll kind of talk about later. And so there it is. That's our, find my slides again. That's it. That's it for setting up a project. The next section, Sierra will talk about a little bit more about like what what the heck is actually in there and what you can do with it. But if you followed along with that so far, you should be in a pretty good place. Is there any specific questions before I move on? We're actually ahead of schedule. I just ran. We have like 5 minutes, so I don't want to move on like too fast. So I'm happy to. Yeah. Okay. Great. Still running makes up perfect. Okay. So yeah. I'm happy to just be quiet and answer questions, and we'll give like 5 minutes for people to kind of catch up.
I know there's that one extra gotcha with the GitHub repo, setting the GitHub pages branch to deploy documentation to. Do you want to wait to do that later, or do you want to just quickly show that?
Oh yeah, I can show that. Okay, there is. So I guess this wasn't. Yeah, we didn't put this in the slides, but eventually, when we want to publish our schemas documentation to GitHub pages, we have to do one bit of extra setup in GitHub, which is to say in settings, come down to pages here, and say that we want to deploy from this branch called GH, which I believe Make Setup did that for us, I believe. Yeah, right. Okay. So that branch should already exist after our initial push to GitHub. So you select GitHub Pages as the branch to deploy to and hit save. So that's one little bit that's not automated. Perhaps not automatable, I guess.
Yeah, probably not automatable. So if you were to get stuck and you needed to clone our tutorial repo, that's the command to do it. You can just copy and paste, and you should get a repository locally that looks an awful lot like Patrick's demonstration.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. But again, we hope you're following along. Okay, Rob got it. Great. Fantastic.
I feel like we needed to hand out prizes. Getting through the environments is like the worst set of slides here.
No tutorial is complete without slightly painful setup procedure.
All right, so maybe I will try to take over the share now, or are we still?
Go ahead and hit stop on my end.
All right, we're back at it. All right, so just to keep us going here, we're going to actually start writing some LinkML YAML now. We're going to develop the model. To set the stage again, we're going to use our sample that I introduced in the introduction. It's a made-up example. Bear with us. But this is our implicit data model, and we're going to try to turn that into LinkML. And I think one thing that helps people learn LinkML metamodel syntax, which is the section that we're going to be learning about now, it's helpful to see how LinkML syntax compares to some other popular modeling frameworks. So if you're familiar with, for example, JSON schema, a LinkML class is equivalent to a JSON schema object. A LinkML slot is equivalent to sorry, go ahead. Okay, a JSON schema property, right? If you're familiar with SQL, a LinkML class is equivalent to a table, a slot is equivalent to a column, and so on. So honestly, when I'm learning the meta model syntax, I definitely lean on some of the existing knowledge I have about different modeling syntax to understand the syntax of LinkML meta model. However, you can always go to this link, which I probably, is it going to share? Oh, how wonderful. Yay, Juno. So you can actually go to our documentation and it describes the meta model. One of the interesting things about LinkML is that LinkML is a LinkML modeling meta model language is a LinkML schema. So we're kind of like eating our own dog food. I think that's what it's called. And it's all documented through an automatic deploy system, just the way we're going to do for our particular model. So you can go there and read a little bit about it in addition. So I'm going to use PyCharm. That's my editor of choice, Python developer. So it's easy for me. You can use any editor of choice you want, even if you just have the command line. Of course, you can use something like Nano, something just to edit this file. When you've completed the setup using the cookie cutter, it's going to give you a directory structure that looks something like this. You're going to have some GitHub actions that are going to be able to run for you. You're going to have this project directory, which we'll get to towards the end of the tutorial. And then you're going to have your source. And in your source is where the YAML, the LinkML model YAML eventually resides. And you also have a data directory where you can put sample data, which is important if you want to run tests against your schema to make sure that any schema changes is accurately reflected in example data. But we're going to edit this particular file, and I'm going to stop sharing this, I think, and we'll start sharing PyCharm. Just give me a minute. We'll wait for Juno to catch up with me. Patrick is lucky. He has 2 screens. I have 1 screen, and so it's telling me to wait. Of course, it didn't happen during the demo. Try again. All right, there we go. So you should be seeing my PyCharm. Yes. All right. All right. So when you get a new project generated with LinkML, it comes with exactly what Patrick was saying. It comes with some boilerplate schema metadata in this YAML file that we need to edit. This is your schema file. And the cookie cutter tries to add a few classes for you. It adds a few slots, and it adds an enumeration. And it adds this boilerplate on top. And the boilerplate is pretty important, right? So I mentioned just briefly that LinkML tries to ground a lot of its semantics in the semantic web. It tries to hide some of that complexity sort of in plain sight, we like to say. So every LinkML model that's generated with the cookie cutter comes with an identifier, and it comes with a name, a title, a description, and a license. And so that all needs to be unique within a project. You'll get it for free being unique by using the cookie cutter, but that's sort of like the semantic pinning of this particular set of schema elements to a particular URL. We also have a heavy reliance on a query form of a universal identifier, right? So a short form of a URI. And this section kind of talks about how we map those short forms of the URIs to the longer form. For this example, any LinkML element that we use, in particular like a data type like string or LinkML type like URI, is going to have the prefix of LinkML, and it's going to resolve to this address. So all that to say, you can kind of keep, when you're just starting out, this boilerplate in place, and we'll see in a bit how to edit this prefix list when you want to add more stuff, but we're just not there yet. It also gives you a default prefix of the name of your repository and a default range of strings. So that means that any new element type you add, any new slot, any new attribute, any new column for, depending on the serialization language you're used to, is going to have a default range of a string, and we'll change all that as well. This section is called imports. I mentioned briefly that you can import one LinkML schema into another LinkML schema, and because LinkML is written in LinkML, we're going to import those data types from the LinkML package itself. Again, kind of just boilerplate. So what I'm going to do as a first step here is just remove all of this, all of the classes it added for me, and all of the slots. Because we're not talking about persons in this tutorial, we're talking about samples. All right, so now we just sort of have a bare classes collection, a bare slots collection, a bare enums collection. And if we think back to our implicit model, I wish I could share 2 screens right now, but I can't. But we have a particular biosample. It's taken from water, and it has a depth, and it has maybe a type, that ontology term that I was showing earlier, where it was taken from. And so if I think about a particular spreadsheet as a group of attributes that describe a single thing, then that single thing is what I call a LinkML class. So because that single thing that I'm trying to describe in this example is a biological sample, I might create a class here called biosample. And that's it. That's a LinkML class. It has no attributes, but it is putting a stake in the ground of what we're calling things in our model and what we're calling attributes or slots. And so in LinkML, you can add a lot of documentation. I'm using Copilot. I don't know if anyone else uses Copilot, but it's really trying hard to do the work for me, which is nice. But in LinkML, you can define a lot of metadata on your classes. So I can write a description right out of the bat. I can say that this class biosample is really an object of that class is a sample of biological material. And that description is going to get posted all the way to my online documentation for me. I know it has a couple of attributes, these slots. I know from my slides that it probably has an identifier. I'm just going to say ID here. It might have a depth, right? It might have a sample type. That was the ENVO term that described the biome. Or maybe I want to say sample biome type if I want to be more descriptive. It might have other things about that sample. It could be, I could want to try to record the latitude it was taken or the longitude, for example. I'm describing attributes of that sample class. Right. And so one of the things that LinkML lets you do as well is define your slots outside of the classes that they're in so that you can add more metadata to those slots as well. So I didn't actually think Copilot was going to be so helpful here, but let's just take its examples, right? So it's making these slots. Copilot knows about LinkML. It can kind of fill in some of these metadata requirements for me. So for an identifier, I'm going to write a description for that identifier of the sample. We'll get to these in a minute. The depth, it's going to give me the depth, right? It's even going to give me I can even say it's a float. I might change that to an int, who knows, right? Or an integer. I might keep the sample biome type a string for now. We'll get to in a bit how to make this an enumeration and constrain it a little bit more. Latitude, let's make it a float. Yeah, that makes sense, right? And I'm writing a description for each one of those, and I'm kind of harping on the description, but I think that's really a place where you can bring different communities in your group together. So you might have some technologists that really understand what required an identifier and type means computationally, but you might have a subject matter expert that really knows what they mean by depth, and that this description is not adequate for depth, right? You might want to say the depth of a sample taken in centimeters, right? Or the ID of the identifier of the sample starting with some prefix with the prefix soil sample. So these descriptions are just text, but they can be very informative when you're trying to share your model with other people, right? And LinkML provides some metadata to let you identify, identifiers in your schema, which means that they have to be, a unique value, and they're required by default. It also lets you specify whether or not something is required. So if depth is required across all my data sets, I can, of course, write required true here, and then it can't be null. And then it gives you a type, and that type can be any. Right now, I'm going to change that to URI or query, and then LinkML will validate that's in a query form of an identifier or a URI form of an identifier. All right, so let me just quickly check my notes here about where we are. So we talked about description, we talked about identifier, we talked a little bit about range. Let's do a little bit more with classes here. So let's take the notion that our sample is really coming from not just a lake, but maybe some other kinds of biomes, for example, right? So we might want to be taking the depth of a sample in a lake, or we might want to be taking the depth of our sample in the soil, right? So let's do a little bit more here in terms of restriction. Right, so let's see. Right, okay. You can't see my slides, but if you're following along on the slides, you can see that what we really want to do is expand our model to allow us to have different kinds of samples, not just from the lake, not just from the soil, not just from the air, but from anything, including like, let's see if we can use this same representation of a sample to describe a sample from Mars, right? Like we want to be able to use this model over and over again and not have someone have to define what sample is again in their project. And so this is where LinkML's hierarchical modeling comes into play. So we have this sample, it has some slots, but if you were to say, I am actually taking samples from the air. I'm not taking them from the ground or from a lake. And so depth here is not really useful to me, right? So I might be tempted to just, of course, make a new one and repeat all of those things again. And maybe in this class, I'm going to just remove depth, right? But then every time I need to, edit this, I'm editing one class, and we want to use some really, convenient programming principles here and not repeat ourselves. So, what we could do is use LinkML's concept of a class hierarchy and make a class that can describe both of them using the shared attributes between them. So I might just define a sample in general and not worry about whether it's from the air or from the ground or from the lake. And I might say that all samples have an ID, all have a latitude and longitude, and all have this type. But that maybe my soil sample here, not just a biosample, but a soil sample might also have the depth field. And instead of repeating myself, I am going to make soil sample via the ISA component here, LinkML. I'm going to say the soil sample really is just a sample, and what that's going to do is inherit all of the properties of the sample class into the soil class. But I'm also going to add to that depth. So all of my samples have these four attributes or properties, but soil sample also has depth. And in air, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to say it is a sample. It's going to inherit ID and sample biome type and latitude and longitude. But instead of depth, I'm going to have altitude. And so down here in my slots, I'm going to add something called altitude. It's going to get a description. It's going to be a float again, and off we go. So now I have 3 different classes: a sample class, which represents sort of a generic sampling of any kind; a soil sample class, which represents the properties of a sample, but also includes depth because I'm taking it deep in the ground. I also have an air sample class that's talking about the properties that are unique to that class, but inherit the sample as well. You can, of course, make a water sample. Thank you, GitHub Copilot. Let's see what else it gives us here. I'm sure it's going to give us a sample. It's going to say it's a description of water. It's going to have a depth as well. So that's sort of how you can use the class hierarchy in LinkML to describe more specific implementations of your classes. Let's see if I forgot anything here. Right. So we have a couple of those. We are sharing them. And now I think if I look back on our schedule, Patrick, you can confirm, I think we had planned to take a little break here before we get into more.
Yeah, we have a break scheduled at 10 after, which was supposed to be covering up through hierarchies. So yeah, I think we could probably just take, if there's like a say questions if there are any before we do a break at 10 after.
Absolutely. So far, it's pretty simple. I mean, you're basically just describing classes and slots. or tables and columns or, objects and properties about your domain. And so as long as you're able to do that sort of relatively easily as a modeler, LinkML should be pretty easy to learn as well. There's definitely more complex syntax here that we'll get into after the break.
Can you hear me?
No. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. For the is a field, when you say sample, is it known what the vocabulary is for that?
Right, so it defaults to thinking that that particular class is within the model you're defining. If you wanted to say, for example, if you wanted to bring in a different model outside of yours, right now LinkML would want you to import that into LinkML. So you couldn't say ISA, for example, schema.org:sample. But there are ways to map the class that you're making to an external schema. So I could say this sample has an exact mapping, for example, and we'll get to this in the tutorial, to schema.org.sample.
Yeah, so I for a lot of the stuff, my screen wasn't updating automatically, so I couldn't see your mouse moving unless I forced a reload or whatever.
Oh, Juno.
It seems to be working now, but
oh, good. And again, maybe I'll just point out that if you want to check out that repo at a particular step, like if you check out step 1 modeling, you can follow along with all the modeling I'm doing. I'm actually looking at my, at that repo on the side here and just trying to echo what we have there. So you can see a much more descriptive schema if you just check out that repo. I guess one thing that I didn't add yet that I think is kind of important to that question, and again, these are very simple things that you just don't have in other modeling languages. So if I look at LinkML, I might want to put an alias here. I hope that came through yet in the share. I want to put an alias here where, another name for this could be biosample, right? So if somebody's searching for what a biosample is in my shared model that has become super popular on the web and everybody wants to use this as their sample model, they can find it pretty easily with just a search on the online documentation. And so just small things like that are going to help make that community development around a shared standard much easier. There's more here, but I want to wait for questions. You can always interrupt me, of course.
Is biosample, is an alias case sensitive or not?
Let's see. So you're asking, like, do I need this one too?
Yeah, I just don't. I mean, I don't. I hope not.
This would be accepted, and so I guess there's So it's not case sensitive. It is case sensitive. Excuse me.
So I have a few easy questions. So we've used Craft is like a cookie cutter to clone, basically to reproduce your template setup for a LinkML repository. We've published that on GitHub, and now, so I don't know. Maybe first, could you walk us through quickly, like all the folders that got created there? Like we focus on the YAML file, but like there's a lot of things that are in that repo.
Yep, that's a great idea. So you've created this repo using our cookie cutter, and the cookie cutter is just like a bootstrapping template software that creates the GitHub directory here. .github has all of the GitHub actions that we think are important for LinkML. So your main GitHub action, without going into too much detail about GitHub actions, is just a technology to run jobs in the background based on your repository commits or your branches that you make. But it's got a main one that's going to run some tests, and it's also going to run, this PyPy action when you make a release, which is going to push up to the Python version of your model to PyPy, so somebody could, bring in your model to their software packages. It's going to, run this command, which generates a test implementation of your documentation, so you can look at it on your pull request in particular and see that the documentation is generating the way you want it to. So that's your GitHub actions you get for free with the cookie cutter. You also you get a docs directory. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's not checked into GitHub here because it's generating that doc for deploying on the GitHub Pages repository branch. You get an examples folder, which has, again, template default entries of actual data that would match the meta model that the cookie cutter gave you. So the first thing you're going to want to do is remove this as well, because we're not talking about people anymore. Maybe even rename it, right? We're going to rename it to samples. And it makes this project directory. And so for LinkML, there's that first set of it, which is the meta model, which we're kind of going through in this section. The other half is the framework and tools. And one of that tool set is to generate a bunch of different serializations of your model. So this project directory holds all those generations. And by default, the cookie cutter will generate the model that you create in Excel format, GraphQL, JSON-LD, JSON schema, OWL, etc. So if I look in here, the first thing it does in an SQL schema generation is it's going to make that default schema and check it in SQL data definition language. Right? Or if I look at the JSON schema, it's going to check in the JSON schema version of that default syntax. And we're going to show you in the tutorial how to regenerate all this, because clearly it's still boilerplate, it's still talking about people and not samples. So that's the project directory. It's kind of an important one. And then our source is, where you're going to do most of your editing. This source docs directory gives you the hook in to edit your doc manually. So if you had some tutorials on how to edit your schema, for example, you might want to put those markdown files in here, and then it'll get bundled in that GitHub action to be deployed with the rest of your automatic documentation. And right here is kind of a very important directory. It's where your model lives. So in the schema subdirectory is where your YAML file lives. That's where we're editing in this tutorial today. It's what I've been working on here. And in the data model directory is the Python data classes version of your model. So again, we haven't gotten to the code generation yet, but so it's still generating it off the template person class, but we'll get to how you generate that off of the new model that you've created as well. And then it also comes with a set of tests. Very simple, just a template of how you write tests in the unit test framework here. It basically loads up your YAML file with a target class on it and runs through and sees if the example data that it generated itself works. So again, we're going to have to edit all of that, but it gives you an example. So if you generate from the cookie cutter, you at least have an example set up to get started on. And then it generates all of these different files. This has to do with poetry, tells you your requirements. It generates a make file with example commands on how to generate all of those different serializations of your model, license, code of conduct, get ignore. And this cruft.json is just what tells Cruft how to look for changes in the upstream cookie cutter. So if you never run Cruft update, join the club. Oftentimes we don't necessarily run Cruft because the whole point of a cookie cutter is just to get you started, to bootstrap it. And then there's a lot of customizations that you can do yourself, and you may not want any updates from LinkML after that. But if you do, that's the config file that controls it.
So what happens in case of, so I guess the LinkML spec evolves with time or something, and so like, and I mean, I'm not talking about breaking changes like a major versions versus minor versions. I don't think, but like let's say there are some updates. I guess you will expect your community of LinkML users to update their schemas to the latest version, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and you can do that two ways. Like I think Cruft gets confusing because Cruft is really telling you, I'm going to update how I want a LinkML project to be configured. Let's say we changed from having, the schema live in source in our cookie cutter to the schema living in a subdirectory called schema, right? We would make that change in our cookie cutter. And if you run Cruft update, suddenly your project is going to change here. And it's no longer going to have a source, it's going to have a schema subdirectory. So those kinds of changes are handled through Cruft, which again, we make very infrequently. You have to hear, our history is in the Obo Foundry and the ontology development community, where they have these tools that help you generate your own ontology. And what they found over time was that they want to fix things. They want to get better in their project bootstrapping software. And there's no way to do that for all the downstream dependencies. Luckily, we enter, later in the development, the 20 years later in the development of these kind of things, and there are tools available. So Cruft helps you do that. If you want to just update the syntax of a LinkML model, or let's say we put in a new generator. Now we're generating, I don't know, XYZ language code, a better Java generator, for example. Then you just have to update your dependencies, right? You'll just, instead of getting this bootstrapped LinkML runtime at 1.1.24, you update to 1.2. And you do that in your pyproject.toml or whatever requirements file that you choose to use for your project. So 2 different kinds of updates here.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, so let's take, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna segue into the break in case you were looking at the time. Yeah. So according to schedule, we're have a short break here, so we'll reconvene at 25 after. So that's like 10 minutes from now.
Perfect. All right, we should probably get back started again. Get into some of the fun stuff. Hopefully we've set the stage of the easy stuff. Okay, so I am actually, if you're following along on the slideshow, I am on slide 57. I'm not going to share it. It's just a cute image generated by the Bing image generator. So I'll just talk through it and just share my PyCharm screen instead. So the next thing we're going to talk about is like how, you know, when you're a modeler of any kind of thing, an ontology, a schema, whatever, you're not living in a vacuum. It's most likely that lots of people have done the same kind of modeling that we're doing today. And one of the best ways that LinkML helps this trouble, where everybody's creating the same model with slightly different syntax, but we're all talking about the same thing, is to provide you some hooks to allow you to map your model to another model. So, you know, one of the best resources that I like to use when I'm looking at trying to define classes in my model is something like the ontology lookup service, OLS, or BioPortal. Oftentimes they have a lot of definitions for things already made for you that you might want to replicate in your model or map to. So LinkML has a meta model component called mappings. There's several different kinds of mappings you can make in LinkML. The one that we like to have people use the most is exact mappings. These are just like RDF mappings. You can look up the definition of these in the LinkML meta model, but it's giving you a way to say that my definition of a sample, for example, is exactly equivalent to the definition used in an external source without having to, you know, refer to that source without having to import it into your model. So one of the models that I work on a lot is BioLink. It's a LinkML model that describes sort of high-level biology from genomics all the way through clinical research in the human domain, kind of in the human biology domain. And so I can say, for example, that I know I want to make an exact mapping to the BioLink definition of sample. Another one that I might want to do is, you know, schema thing. Now, you have to kind of think when you're making these exact mappings, is that true? In schema.org, which is, again, defined by this prefix map up here, is the definition of thing the same as a sample? We really might want to be careful here, right? Because thing is probably much more broad than sample. So I can use something called broad mappings, again, to define that, you know, if you're looking at my model and you know what a thing is in schema.org, but you don't know what a sample is, you might want to consider that thing is a little bit more broad than sample, something like that. There's also, you know, narrower mappings. So if I wanted to say that this was narrowly mapped to, let's see, another model, NMDC that I talked about earlier, maybe NMDC has a biosample class, and I want to map to that. And so in that, here's an interesting case where I'm going to need to edit my prefix map because I've just introduced a prefix that this particular model doesn't know about yet, the NMDC prefix. So up here in my prefixes collection, and Patrick will probably show you this when we talk about validation, you'll get an error if you don't do this. So LinkML kind of protects you against making these kinds of errors. But I need to define what I mean by NMDC. It's one of those RDF in plain sight kind of things. I need to say that NMDC refers to this site w3.id.org, NMDC, and within that context, within that model, they have a biosample class, and it's narrowly mapped. It's more specific than my sample class. So that's sort of how you use mappings. A lot of our generators recognize these mappings. We'll make a link to them. Another really important component in the meta model that you can use here is class URI. So if you really are interested in making the RDF version of your model, and you know that that your class that you're defining in LinkML is exactly equivalent to, again, BioLink sample in this example. I can say that the class URI for this class is BioLink sample, and what LinkML will do is then go translate BioLink sample into the full URI and make that your RDF class. So it'll kind of ignore all of this metadata and say, because you've specified the URI for me, I'm going to go and use the definition in BioLink. So that's an important one if you really do want to be, heavy on the reuse side of a particular model. Another one that's very handy here is slot usage, and we're going to talk about that more in different contexts here. But there's a meta model component called slot usage. It allows you to specify how to use a slot within the context of a class. So you might have an identifier that is represented by ID. It's a slot. It's a very common slot. But in one class, you might want to have the identifier use a query that is specific to that class. And in another class, you want it to use an identifier query or URI that's specific to that class. So, maybe in my sample class, I say that the ID is fine, but maybe down in my soil sample, I want to say that the ID has to be of a particular kind. So I might say here pattern, and let me just make sure I'm getting the simple. Yeah, okay. So I might say that the ID here has to start with a prefix of soil sample, and it can be any numbers or letters, and that's how it ends. So this is actually a regular expression. It's using a keyword pattern, and it's saying the slot ID in this class must start with soil sample as a prefix. Whereas I might have a completely different slot usage down here in the air sample and say that my air sample, has to start with a pattern of air. And this is just one way of constraining that identifier. It's just to sort of show you how you can use regular expressions to constrain a string to something more than just any letters and numbers and digits, etc.
I have a question.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just for the topic before, when you were talking about the reuse for classes and those things. So let's say, for instance, Rob here develops a schema about marine biology, and I'm working on marine biology too, but I'm not aware that he's developing this schema. So like, is there a way to like if it's not on one of the main repos to discover what he's doing and perhaps like either say I'm map terms from my stuff to his stuff, or to completely reuse and add things to his.
Yep. There's two ways I can think of. One is you can use LinkML to serialize your model into OWL, and then you can of course submit that OWL to any of these ontology repositories. You can submit it to BioPortal or Ontology Lookup Service or any of the other ones that exist sort of as registries of all of this space. The other thing we have at LinkML, which I don't think I can show you without stopping my share, but I'll put it in the chat after I'm done talking. We do have a LinkML registry, and we ask people to sort of like manually register their schema. So that's like very low tech. People don't do it very often. You make a great point. Like, how do we discover these things? We're hoping to develop that registry out in the next couple of years if we, based on funding. But right now it's a little manual. The schemas we work on are serialized to OWL, and then they're shoved up into Ontology Lookup Service and BioPortal. So if you actually went and looked in Ontology Lookup Service for BioLink, you'd find the classes and slots and stuff in that repository. But it's a very good point, and I think another thing that we're trying to do is host like monthly community meetings. Again, low tech, but we have people present their work, and then we kind of make note of these kind of different efforts that are happening in the LinkML space, at least. I don't know, Patrick, Kevin, do you guys have any other ways that you would go about finding a schema?
If you're more geared towards Python, some people do publish to PyPI. There's not much of a discoverability there, but it is a way to to share something between projects. It's probably the only other thing I can think of, but I think, Sierra, what you covered is probably the main answer to that question.
maybe GitHub like tags on repositories, which is just find a LinkML tagged project that happens to look like a cookie cutter schema that we used also.
Thank you.
Yeah, honestly, that's actually a really good way to do it. If you look in the LinkML repository itself, GitHub provides you already a link to the dependencies on your project, right? So you can say which projects actually use LinkML, and it'll give you kind of like an automated registry of all the different places that cookie cutter's been used. It's an interesting idea. I like that one, Kevin. Okay, so we are mapping around here. We've sort of talked about that, and we talked about slot usage a little bit. I think another thing to remember, again, not a very technical implementation here, but this description is probably not that great, right? And if we're really committed to using reusable components here, it's likely that we're looking in ontology lookup service or for another ontology term that describes this better. And before the meeting, of course, I went and looked this up, and there is a much better definition for what we're meaning here by sample. And I'm just going to copy and paste it in. It's from a ontology called SIO, semantic integrated ontology. I think I can't remember the definition of that, but it has a very good definition for a sample. And again, I'm going to just link directly to that definition. So yes, I'm kind of duplicating effort here. I'm kind of like copying and pasting that. And I think there's a real trade-off there between being very descriptive of your modeling to somebody who's using it who has no idea what an ontology is or whether or not ontology lookup surface exists or anything, and trying not to repeat yourself. So usually what I do for my models is I use a definition that I like. It might be specific to my project, but I make sure I put in that mapping to an actual ontology term. So if somebody did want to look this up, they could just Google it. They'd find the description would be about the same or maybe even identical, and they'd have a way to understand what I was talking about outside the context of our specific project. Let's see. And then I think the last thing I wanted to say here, we talked about patterns. We talked about, ID prefixes. So another way I can constrain my model is this concept of ID prefixes. And again, we're very concerned about the short form URI representation in LinkML. So we're going to talk about prefixes a lot. We're going to talk about expanding those into URIs. This ID prefixes as construct allows you to say that for this class, the identifier for it should come from XYZ repository. So if this wasn't an example and I really was taking samples from the environment and putting them in a database, I could say that, my prefix, my class must come from a prefix space like NMDC, right? And that's actually an ordered list. So if you look at the BioLink model, for example, we have a class for gene, and in that ID prefixes construct, you might see all sorts of different resources that are available already for genes. You might see Ensemble, you might see the equivalent at of course now I'm NCBI, right? Like there's all these different kinds of resources that provide gene identifiers. And that's a ranked list. So you can kind of say in your model, I prefer NCBI gene identifiers first. And then if you can't find an NCBI gene identifier for this class, then look for the Ensemble identifier, etc. And that gives you a way to both be broad enough to allow harmonization of resources across many different spaces, but also narrow enough to show an indication to your user about what they can expect in that field. So very low tech, but very helpful when you're doing this kind of work. All right, and then I think I'm going to stop there and switch topics over to enumerations, and I'm going to stop my share and try to share the slides again because I think it's just easier to see from some boilerplate here. Let's see if it'll let me stop and restart. Do you know? And I guess I'll just sort of fill the space while we're waiting for Juno to respond. There are a lot of modeling components that we can't sort of cover in this tutorial. If you're interested, if we sparked your interest, I would definitely try to go and look at that documentation for the LinkML meta model. You can do all sorts of things. You can make rules that say, for this slot, if I have this value, then make sure that this other slot is of this value. There's rule syntax. There's all sorts of different kinds of like unique keys. I can say these 4 slots must be unique in the context of all the other, rows in my table. There's a lot of stuff there that you can do. All right.
I'm going to put a link in the chat, just like if there's one documentation page you want to start from to get more like advanced topics in modeling, that the link I just put in is probably where to start.
Perfect. Thank you. I wanted to sort of briefly cover enumerations in LinkML because this is a really great place for ontologies to come into your model. And there's a lot of different ways to do it. So this is a particular enumeration. Again, it's a completely different use case, so just bear with me. But enumerations in LinkML kind of have this structure in the YAML. They have a name, and then they have a list of permissible values. So what this means is, like nanotube, if I'm trying to validate data according to my model, and I say that the data slot's range is this enumeration, then the values of that data slot must be one of these permissible values in literally this context. But what you can do further with LinkML is you can assign a meaning to each of those two. So if you want your users to be able to just write nanotube in their spreadsheet and validate it, great. But behind the scenes, you can say the meaning of the nanotube is actually this ontology term. And when we generate things, it'll replace those, nice features for users to just be able to type in what they want with the actual meaning of that ontology. You can get a little bit more complicated too. You can use the LinkML component reachable from, which says, I know that everything in this particular slot, we're going to call it maybe biome, and it's going to have a range of this biome enumeration. All of the values of that should be reachable from the Envo ontology. So this is basically a clue to LinkML that says, hey, any Envo term here is going to make sense for me. And you can be a little bit more specific. You can say, well, the source node is actually the top level term I want from Envo is biome. I don't want anything else in this other branch. So if you're thinking about something like the gene ontology, which has 3 branches, cellular component, biological process, molecular function, I can say that the source node for that is just molecular function, and then all the ontology terms. And molecular function will be valid, but not cellular component, etc. There's a whole bunch of more metadata you can assign to these enumerations. So for example, I can say that I only want the terms in this ontology that are subclass of biome, right? I don't want part of, I don't want related to, other predicates that you might use in the ontology. And you can have Boolean combinations as well. So if I say that this, non-aquatic biome is reachable from Envo and its source is biome, but I don't want to get anything else underneath biome from Alpine or Mediterranean or whatever, I can subtract out parts of that ontology. So I would say that the only caveat here with these kinds of constructs is that because LinkML supports so many different serializations of your model, some of these components are better supported in different serializations. So you might have full support for this kind of feature in JSON schema, but you might not have full support for it in, the TypeScript generator. And that's just a mark of our open source project, but this is the idea here. And even if the generated code isn't exactly, serializing this entire enumeration for you, what it does show you is metadata to your users and to your development staff and to your subject matter experts on your project, what you mean by this field. And honestly, low tech, but incredibly important to sharing models. All right, so we talked about that. We talked a little bit about slot usage. We talked a little bit about pattern constraints and ID prefixes. As Patrick put in the chat, he put in a great link for you. Here's another one. There's more advanced constructs.
Just a quick question before moving on. So we saw that okay, I will write a spec in LinkML, and then if I use it to convert to these other format like a JSON schema or something like, how do these rules translate basically like the exclusion and I guess from one language to another, like there will be a difference in the stuff that we cannot express maybe.
You're exactly right. And some of our serializations are just not capable of supporting the rich syntax of LinkML. For example, JSON schema doesn't really have a hierarchical representation of its objects, really. So there's things that we do to help with that, right? You can make some in JSON schema, for example, you can have a reference to another class, right? You can do some of that stuff, but not all of our serializations will support the entire syntax. There are some syntax elements in LinkML that will only serve OWL or RDF, for example, like the slot and class URI. None of that really matters to an SQL serialization of the model. That language just doesn't really support the concept of a class or a slot URI, but it's incredibly important in the RDF serialization. So, we're trying to be sort of like a toolkit that lets you reach your model into a lot of different technology stacks. But you're right, there's sometimes it just isn't supported. But again, I'll say that even just having metadata to describe your slots and classes can go a long way to helping your users reuse your data. I'm not exaggerating when I say we just get a spreadsheet and we don't even know what the meta model is, right? So I don't know. Does anyone else, Patrick, Kevin, you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, I think I was actually just going to kind of make the same point that you just sort of made at the end there, which is that, like, not every tool in the LinkML ecosystem does or even can support every LinkML meta model construct, as you pointed out. And so at the end of the day, sometimes the value in adding those to your LinkML model is that it's a form of documentation, and that's useful as well. You're at least you at least have a structured way of saying what you mean. And hopefully most tools understand it, but sometimes, yeah, you will bump up against a tool that doesn't understand what reachable from means or can't do anything with it. We try to make that as clear as possible, but it's always a challenge. And the other thing I will also say is that the LinkML meta model itself sort of tends to work ahead of the rest of the tooling. So new features might get added into the LinkML meta model, but it'll take time for those to get picked up and utilized in the tooling, like in the generators that we'll talk about in a little bit. Sierra, you're muted. You're muted.
Oh my gosh, I was muted. Okay, so the last thing I'll say with modeling for this part of the tutorial is just that LinkML does try to handle deprecation just like a software project would. It's really important not to just delete elements out of your schema. As I said before, sometimes community development is the most important thing about your model. You want people to reuse your model. You don't want them to do it over again. And so if you're going to change something, if you're going to deprecate sample or biosample and turn it into sample, you want to give people a heads up. And also, because we're so grounded in RDF and in the semantic web, we really want those elements to stick around forever. If you give something a URI or a query, you don't want it to just disappear because, number one, it's hard for people to use your schema and then migrate if they're not ready to migrate yet. But it's really important to tell yourself that you have changed your model, right? So if I deprecate Gene and then I thought, oh, Sierra, that was stupid. I don't want to deprecate Gene. I want to have a record of that. So pretty common sense here. But LinkML provides a couple of meta model elements that are helpful. So you can have the deprecated meta model component on your schema. You can say, and it's actually the range of the deprecated meta model element is string. So you can write a description about why it was deprecated, for example. You can also use the deprecated element has exact replacement meta model component. So you can say, well, if I deprecated biosample, for example, I can replace that with the sample class. And it gives both programmatically and just from a documentation point of view, the user an idea to say, oh, go ahead and replace my biosample class with sample. I can also track the last time this meta model component was updated and who updated it. Again, helps with project cohesion. And then there's a couple of interesting little things that we've just recently added to the stack where, depending on your reliance on RDF or on your online documentation, you can include or exclude those deprecated elements. So I guess our best practice here is never delete anything out of your model, but if you have to deprecate something, put it in another YAML file and include it where you need to. So include it in generating your online documentation. Include it when you're generating a LinkML YAML that you want someone programmatically to use downstream of your application. If somebody wants to reuse, for example, my BioLink model, I want to provide them a YAML file that includes the deprecated elements because maybe they're not ready to upgrade. But you can also exclude it. So if you have part of your application is really dependent on a JSON schema and you don't want to see those deprecated elements, that makes perfect sense. You don't want someone to accidentally put them in there. You can exclude them from the generation of your online documentation or from your JSON schema generated element. And I just wanted to introduce really quickly something that's in beta right now with LinkML. We know that as models change and as your project grows and biology evolves, nothing is going to stay the same. And there is a space in LinkML to write a declarative transformation. So for example, if we're saying latitude and longitude are actually pretty, outdated concepts when you're talking about locating something on the globe, and instead people want to start saying just what the GPS position is. I'm not an expert on geography, so if this is a dumb example, forgive me. But if I did want to convert latitude and longitude in existing data with existing schemas into that GPS position slot, I could write a declarative transform in LinkML syntax using the LinkML map tool that says for samples, I want to get the samples from this sample class, but I want to derive a new slot. And the GPS position is actually latitude plus longitude. And you can write all sorts of different expressions here and just, have a way to help people migrate their data to your new schema. Also record how you've been transforming that schema, let people see the transformation that's happening. And, again, all about transparency and how you manage your data. But it's beta, so that's one of our areas of development. We're really rounding out this tool in the next year. Okay, and we work for Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Our PI is Chris Mungle, and if you've ever heard of Chris Mungle, he likes to stay on the forefront of technology, and so do we. And so we've been experimenting a lot with large language models and LinkML. We have a large language model, component that you can plug into your ChatGPT online interface, and you can ask LinkML questions to that little agent directly. You can say, what does the meta model component slot usage mean? How do I use deprecation? It'll respond very nicely. If you've never used a large language model before, just don't be afraid to ask it direct questions. It knows a heck of a lot about LinkML, and it can really help you start. You can also ask it to generate a schema based on a bunch of text that you give it. So I've tried to, take an abstract from a paper, for example, and say, generate me a schema in LinkML, and it will do that. Some caveats: LLMs love to hallucinate identifiers, and they make syntax mistakes sometimes. So what I really use it for is when I'm trying to learn a new software development tool, I use it a lot to give me sort of like a bootstrap or a leg up in doing it, and you can do that with LinkML as well. Okay, I think you've heard enough from me. This is a rest stop. So if you want to get a fully working schema and you weren't able to keep up with just typing, you can check out the modeling tag here. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing, I believe, because I think I'm going to turn it over to someone else now. Yeah, Patrick.
And I'm going to start sharing. Okay. So this should be a pretty short section about schema linting. So schema linting is sort of just a fancy way of saying like enforcing some best practices in your schema development. As we saw, primarily we write our LinkML models in a YAML file, which kind of leaves for quite a bit of flexibility, which can be good, but sometimes maybe not so good. So as a quick motivating example, let's imagine that I had this schema where I have a class called latitude space longitude, and that's actually perfectly fine as far as YAML is concerned. But if I, and we'll talk about this in more detail, but we've hinted at a number of times that you can generate Python code from your schema. And so if we were to just be completely naive and like translate that class name from your YAML file into Python code, like this is like a non-starter, because that's like not even like valid Python syntax. So we just simply can't do that. What we do end up doing is like, fudging this class name a little bit into, latitude, longitude without the space. But now there's a bit of confusion here because, well, I have a class name in my YAML file with a space in it, but if I'm working with the Python generated artifact as well, it has a different class name. So it's kind of like, it's confusing there. So obviously the right answer is that like I should have named it differently. I should have named that class differently, like right from the get-go. And so the LinkML linter is a tool that's designed to kind of help suss out these issues before you find out about them the hard way. And so it's kind of it's a rule-based tool. So it just checks a series of it checks your schema against a series of rules that it considers to be best practices. And it's configurable too. So that is that's the basic structure of the command. But let's just dive right in and run it against our schema. Now I've checked out I have this set to I've checked out the tag where Sierra left off. So this may look slightly different than what you have, but so you may get slightly different answers than I get, but it should be pretty similar. So anyway, so I'm going to say poetry run LinkML lint, and then I'm just going to give it the directory where our schema lives. You can point it to a file or a directory. And so we got a few issues here. And if I flip over here, we can kind of break them down a little bit. The first part of what it's telling you is it's giving you some indication of the severity. It can generate warnings or errors based on how you configure this thing. It's telling you what rule is being violated. So you can see there's some issues with canonical prefixes. There's also some issues with from this rule called recommended, which is checking to see if recommended slots have been filled in. I should say meta model slots have been filled in. And then a more detailed description of like what went wrong here. So there's a few ways we can resolve warnings that the linter tells us about. One is you can just fix it. You can do the thing that it's telling you to do. And in this case, this is telling me that my class air sample does not have the recommended slot called description. So you can see my sample class has a description, but my air sample class doesn't. So I can say description, a sample from there. I don't know. Maybe that's a good description, maybe not. And then the next one is similar. It's a class soil sample doesn't have a slot called description. Sample from the soil. Okay. So if I were to run this again, so I got rid of those first two, and now I'm just left with some of these canonical prefix issues. Now you can read the, there's, if I go back up to the documentation on the linter, all these rules are sort of spelled out here. And I could read canonical, oh, it's the very first one. I can read exactly what it's doing. And for some of these, I can also see that there's additional like configuration possible. And so I'm not going to get into all the details about what this is trying to check or what this is trying to prevent. But this is just to sort of quickly point out that if I want to get rid of these warnings, one possibility is to fix it so that like it agrees with what the default linter's configuration is expecting, or I can make my own configuration in order to say, actually, I want it to check a slightly different thing than the default. And so to start with configuring, oops. Get back in here. I can make a LinkML lint configuration file. So I'm going to make a new file called .linkmllint.yaml. And then I'm going to say that I want to start with the sort of recommended configuration by saying extends recommended. And then from there, I'm going to configure certain rules beyond what the recommended configuration says. And in particular, I'm interested in modifying the canonical prefixes rule. Oh, there's no way I can spell that right. I'm just going to copy that. Canonical prefixes. And again, I'm going to refer back to the documentation to see, okay, there's this prefix mapped context thing that I can tell it about. Again, I'm not trying to get into all the details about what this means, but this just sort of a little demo here. And I'm basically just saying, I only want you to, only care about the oboe prefixes. Like those are the ones I care the most about. That's essentially what this is saying. And so I could run poetry run LinkML. I could tell it, --config. Get back into slideshow. --config, give it the config file. But the linter is actually set up to look for this as a conventional file name. So you can name your config file anything you want, and you could pass the --config option, or if you just name it with this conventional file name, you don't actually have to provide it to the command line. So since this file now exists, I can run the linkml lint command again, and hey, we fixed one issue by modifying the schema itself, doing what it suggested, and then we resolved the other one by adding a bit of configuration in here. Okay, so now that we've kind of gotten to a good state where the linter says you're doing a good job authoring this schema, we could now kind of go beyond the initial sort of the default configuration. We can go beyond that and even be more strict if we want to. For example, we could enable another rule. So going back to the documentation, these ones that are marked with a star are part of that recommended set of, basically the default set of rules. And you can see that there's one in here called tree root class. This is not part of the like recommended set, but if it, you know, if it's applicable to your schema, you're more than welcome to opt into using it. And in particular, so this is looking for classes that have been marked as tree root true in your schema. And you can see that in our schema, we do have one. We have one called sample collection, a class called sample collection, that's considered to be a tree root in our schema. And you know, again, this is the details of what that means exactly is kind of beside the point. You know, you could read about it in the LinkML documentation. But in very briefly, tree root true just is an indication that like if I'm looking at data that's in sort of a tree-like format, like JSON or YAML, that this class kind of represents the root of such a tree. Okay, so yeah, so if I can enable this linter rule by adding it to my config file. Copy that. Paste that into my config file. So I'm saying for this rule, I want to enable it by setting the level to error. So any violations of this will be raised at the error level. I'm telling it, you know, you should expect to see a class with tree root true called sample collection, and that it really does exist. So if I run this, that's good. Now, you know, if somebody unsuspectingly, you know, or somebody who's let's say new to this project, they didn't realize, they didn't understand why this was important, they accidentally changed this to false, and they ran this, then they would be presented with you say, hey, you're supposed to, the linter says you're supposed to have a tree root class in your schema. And then the last way that we can use the linter to be more strict is if we add the -- validate command line flag. And what that's going to do is it's just going to do a little sort of extra work to check that your schema really does adhere to the LinkML meta model. So coming back over here, it takes a little longer to run when you do this, but yeah. So currently there's no issues, right? This is good. This is what we'd expect. But if I, you know, if I said like foo bar here, right? Like that's still valid YAML, but it's not. This doesn't adhere to the LinkML meta model anymore. And so when I run this with -- validate, it's going to say in your sample class, you can't put foo there. Like that's not part of the thing. So that's what the validate flag is all about. And then there's a few, you know, you can check, you know, there's a few other interesting command line flags here. You can use -- help to look at those. You know, it has to do, you know, there's things about how warnings are handled and stuff like that. So yeah, okay. So that's it for linting. It's just a quick little tool that, you know, we use to make sure that we're kind of following some best practices as we're developing our models. And I think I'm handing this over to Kevin now to start talking about documentation, unless there's any questions.
Yeah. There we go. And share. No. Oh, there's the Windows Forever. Okay. So I think a key use of LinkML is producing documentation for your model. And it's sort of how everyone can know about it and changes. And I can sort of like ad-lib that I'm a user of a model that Sierra works on, and I use the documentation quite a bit. So yes, it is the socialization of the model. So we can use a generator to produce the models. And within the project, the GitHub action is going to do it. I am, let's see. Slightly over. And doc, try it out. Oh, no. And this is your beautiful material theme docs that you get. And it shows you your classes and slots and enumeration and types, and can navigate down and see. This is a very important column in a deeper schema to know whether the slot has been defined directly or it comes down via inheritance. And kill that. It's possible to configure your theme and the method of what's produced. And these are some examples of themes. And this is an example of modifying your template for the documentation. I was really focused on the code generation part. Deputy editing in the
Yeah. Do you want me to show?
Yeah.
Okay.
Talk me through it a little bit, because some code generation kind of.
No problem. So what comes with your cookie cutter is just basically an about.md. And what happens by default is LinkML will go out and refer to its package container of Jinja templates. They're again another bootstrapping tool, another boilerplate tool to let you create this documentation. And I just wanted to show sort of briefly here that you can modify those Jinja templates. So if you go to let's see. So if you go to the LinkML proper repository and you copy over your documentation, it might be easier if I just share it really quick. But if you go to
yeah, let me do that.
All right, so you should be seeing the endless repeat there. So, all right, let's see, what are you seeing? Apologies. You should be seeing LinkML. In our package repository, there are templates, generators, docgen. There are these templates. And so this is kind of giving you an insight into how we're actually generating that documentation. There are a series of markdown templates written in Jinja that tell you go query the model that I've just given you and throw up the details of that model on a markdown page. So in this one, this is the class Jinja template, and it's saying go get the title from the schema element, and does it use URIs? If it does, then do some work here to make the URI the most important part. If it doesn't, show something else. In this section, maybe down here, it's generating a schema diagram. So if I look at BioLink model, which is one that I'm really familiar with, you can see that Jinja template translates directly into what's produced here. So it's grabbing the title and it's displaying it with this kind of, wrapper, and then it's using the description from the model, and it's generating these nice diagrams. And in fact, I can sort of click on these diagrams and get to another section of my model. And you can customize those. So you can say, well, I don't want to see this inheritance thing because my model's pretty to that Jinja template and remove it, right? None of that stuff is necessary. You can just use the defaults and it works just fine. But we just wanted to say that there's a possibility for you to customize this. Some of the nice places to customize it that people have found are, deciding which, let's just look this a little bit bigger, deciding which kind of schema diagram that you want to use, for example. So this one is generating a kind of UML using Mermaid templates. I wouldn't say that it's completely the best UML you've ever seen, but for people that aren't familiar with UML, for example, it does give them a relationship between classes. We have another generator contributed by one of our open source developers, Plant UML. It's another UML diagramming tool that does a little bit more to show you the cardinality between classes, and uses a little bit more rigorous UML syntax, diamonds and closed arrows and things. So you can kind of customize that. You can also look at this in an ER diagram kind of way. So if you wanted to use the generator to make SQL-like diagrams, you could do that as well. So there's lots of ways to customize these things, but out of the box, you get a lot for free. So this BioLink mostly uses stuff out of the box. Most of this stuff is for free. There are a few things that we've done in BioLink, for example, to change that. So we've written a couple of custom, displays here because BioLink is so hierarchical. It has such a deep nesting. We have kind of a simple viewer that lets you kind of see how different classes are related, for example. Or, we might want to focus in our application on a particular instance of the model. And so it's showing you at a more specific way how to view that hierarchy. So you can make customizations. I think the best way to go in and look at that is just to look at some of these slides and run some of these commands, like make doc test. I think Kevin you just ran that, didn't you? So it comes up with a documentation site on your local system, and you can kind of fuss with it depending on your comfort with UML. Right. So I think I talked about that. I don't know, Kevin, do you want to walk through how we deploy to GitHub pages? It should almost all the way be done for you.
I don't know if I have mine checked out as like its own.
Okay, we can show. Here's another thing we can do. We can show in fact, while we've been talking here, so our project has actually been running its actions, its GitHub actions that we talked about, and so I was pages for us. And so if you look, you can see that it created this site. I actually can hear a lot of background noise, Kevin. It created this site. It deployed this up. This is what Kevin was showing. And it actually deployed the documentation with, hopefully, the default mermaid diagram. So you can kind of see that, without us doing anything, it kind of showed what we just modeled. You can look at different slots. You can look at different classes. You can look at the mappings that we created. So it's saying, for this particular class, we're going to link it directly to itself. It shows you the source, the actual YAML that we produced. And then if if we want to flatten out the hierarchy, it's going to show you which of those slots came from our sample parent class and which came from, the class itself. So we would see depth being soil sample specific, and the rest of these coming from that upper level class. So I think honestly that's all we wanted to show you. If you want to run, if you want to look at your particular GitHub repository and look for the actions there, if you set the GitHub pages correctly, you should also already have at least what you've developed so far in terms of documentation deployed for you, because it's going to run on every push to your repository. And I think this gotcha is just what Patrick talked about earlier. You need to definitely, configure GitHub to use the GitHub Pages branch to display your doc. Again, you can check out step 3 documentation. That's going to have all of the stuff we talked about, plus some customizations to those Jinja templates. You can check those out. And now, maybe without the hard documentation part, Kevin, maybe you can do code generation.
And hopefully, let's see if I've got my audio a little bit better filtered with this headset. Let me share again. Okay. All right. Catch up. Okay. So there are. No, I do not want that window. This slide describes the way that the Alliance of Genome Resources is using LinkML to define a schema that is a data import schema. And so there's many members who have to support their data in the same format. And so LinkML is providing that constraint upon them. And NMDC uses it in this way. The project I work on, I edited a slide that Sarah started, and it turned into a little bit of chaos. But we use 2 different LinkML schemas, and really in 2 different roles. And we use the BioLink model for our data ingest. And essentially, there's sources that are in the wild that are their own individual TSV or JSON formats, and we need to convert all that data into a LinkML model. And so we're using Pydantic classes there so that everything passes through the Pydantic class generated by the BioLink model, and that has the effect of validating each row as it's sort of produced, and those go into a Solr index. But separately, we have the problem that we want to describe we want to create a data model for our application as well, and that's sort of what this second schema is, and it sort of refers back to BioLink model for the kinds of nodes and edges that are in the graph, but then it's got to represent things just like a request bundle, or a bundle of parameters, and then the response format for that. And so that's used. The Pydantic is used in the FAST API and gets sent out of the API, and then in the user interface, we also use generated TypeScript classes to work with those models. So as a sort of like general assignment, this is what happens in the BioLink model. You may want to sort of produce your Python classes and publish them up to PyPI, and so that they can be sort of shared with the world. I kind of wanted to pop over and demonstrate sort of from the point of view of working with LinkML model with the goal of generating code. So schema, make sure I'm back in my default state. how's my background audio? Is
Much better. Yeah, it's fine.
at the awkward situation that if I use my AirPods, I have noise canceling, and I don't hear the background noise, but you guys do. And then this way, I have no noise canceling, so I hear all the background noise, but you don't. As so it's all right. I wanted my root sample collection has slot samples, and I want to mess with that slot samples to demonstrate changes. So slots samples is currently inlined true, and so if I right now in my make file, I have along with Gen project and the configuration of Gen project. I'll say that we the obvious thing to do would be to add Pydantic and TypeScript here, but they're not supported in Gen project yet, and so that's like a bug. That's sort of a bug we need to work out. And so the sort of fallback is to put them in the make file, and that's done here, passing sort of an argument and producing these two. So if I make Gen project, it will produce those two files, which are open. There's my Pydantic model of this schema, and lots of imports at the top. There's some fair amount of complexity. There's this sort of Pydantic configuration stanza, and then you get into your enumerations and your classes. And so you can see sort of the definition of your biome enumeration. Here's the sample collection tree root class that is your sort of right now is a dictionary mapping IDs to one of the three. So since they all extend, it makes this union of what's being extended. All the types of samples, or I guess the two types of samples and the root class are all valid in that union. And then here it's producing each of the field types. It's using enumerations, and then a nice little extra is it is producing this pattern ID function that is doing a regex check against the prefix value there, and that comes directly from this slot usage ID pattern air sample there. So that's sort of it's a really nice situation case of a model constraint going directly into the code. The thing I wanted to kind of touch on is the mapping between how you get a list, how you get a dictionary, how you get a string, like just whether you have just the ID or whether you have the whole object. And the property that composes that is it's the slot definition that I want to go to. And the slot definition of samples, the samples collection. So if I say, so right now we had a dictionary mapping from the ID type string to an object. If I say inline false and then regenerate my project, then my sample collection is now, it's not a sample object anymore. It's just a list of strings. So it's still multi-valued, and it's not inlined, and so it's not a whole object. So that's sort of when you're dealing through data model and you want to have just the list of IDs. That's how you'd sort of represent it in the model, and that's sort of the code that would be produced. And then separately, if I do want to have the whole object but I want them stored as a list, not an ID pointing to the class, for lookup. And that's really it's really very dependent on what your code is doing, whether you want a list or a dictionary. You do inline as lists, true. Generate, and then now it's a list that's a union of the class types. And I can pop over to the TypeScript model 2, which is, as you can see, this is the whole thing. This is just TypeScript interfaces, and it's less full featured than Pydantic. Pydantic is does quite a bit more and sort of further along, but you still have your enumerations, and that's the sample collection is defining it. In this case, it's using inheritance of the language, so it's not specifying all three separately, but it's producing that. And then I guess I should just in that sort of set of comparisons, it's probably worth looking at the Python also. And this is what we're moving away from, or sort of moving towards Pydantic, but it is also the most sort of full featured, in that it's sort of it keeps track of the queries of the class and the URI, and this is sort of does quite a bit in that respect, and it does a bit more magic, I think, in data parsing. Let's see. And so I guess we did have this. You can put things into the project. You can also run these things directly. And so I'll just copy and paste a chunk of this command. I'm gonna pipe it to less instead. But you can. So this is poetry run is kind of the Simon Says. That just puts you in your virtual environment. And then gen Pydantic's name is the script, and then this is the path to the model. If we go to less, this will just sort of print that. And I think I had TypeScript in there too, but I shouldn't be improvising this.
JSON schema dash JSON dot schema dash schema, I think is, yeah.
I was going to do SQL DDL, but I don't remember the command off the top of my head. But there's the JSON schema output directly. Is gen LinkML the one that will sort of read your LinkML schema and then? Well,
it'll like make all the imports work correctly, and you can generate like a YAML file that is the prettified version.
Yeah. It's funny, if I just look into, if I peek into my virtual environment, I can, that's a way to get sort of a look at all of the generators. So is it a gen LinkML? Is gen LinkML producing JSON rather than YAML? But yeah, so that's using generators directly, and sort of the connection to okay, and we went through this a little bit. Gen project is sort of where you choose which generators you want, or config.yaml is where you sort of can set up your gen project. Okay. There we go. There's the OWL, so you can get your schema to an ontology browser. And if you do the tutorial checkouts, I can just mention that you can throw some curly braces on this, or just comment out the generator args if you don't have any args to pass in. And then deployment to PyPI. I have not done through the cookie cutter myself, but I can look at these GitHub actions with you and see that it's already nicely set up for dynamic versioning, and it will build, and it will just do the publish action. And so the extra steps are the configuration on the PyPI side to set up your sort of authentication and how to set up that publishing. All right, and now I can pass back to Patrick for
I think we have I think on the schedule we have a quick 10-minute break. Yeah.
Just before we do that, like, thank you, Kevin. Kevin's family unfortunately has been sick for the last week or so, and so he's kind of like trying to do this on the fly, and so I appreciate it, Kevin. And if you did get lost along that way, it's not Kevin's fault. It's the terrible Eugene sickness that's going around where we live, and you can definitely follow along with the checkout. And if there's questions, of course, we can answer them. And now a break. Let's do
break. If there's questions, feel free to throw them out. Otherwise, I think we'll start again at quarter till.
Maybe a quick question. So like I was trying to follow along, but like I'm still not exactly sure what we've accomplished here. Sorry.
I have a question along the same lines, and maybe it's even more naive. So when you run something and it's generating Python code, I don't really know what that code would do, for one thing. And the second thing is I don't know what PyPI is.
Yeah, those are great questions. Yeah, so PyPI is like a package repository where if you're developing in Python, you can go and grab the package that someone else has written and use it in your code. And so in LinkML, like, you might have a use case where you're trying to write an application on top of a model, and you want the classes in your application to match exactly what your subject matter expert said in the model. And so what LinkML does is it takes that YAML file and it runs through code generation to make the Python classes that you're going to use in that model. And so what we're trying to demonstrate is that it's sort of push button. So from the command line, for example, in your LinkML project you just built, you can run gen Pydantic, which is the command line tool for making a Pydantic class out of your model, and it will generate Python for you. Once you have that Python, you can stick it up in PyP, and someone else from outside your project can come along and say, import Sierra's project dot whatever, and it will pull in that class, and now suddenly my Sierra's project is being used in a different application. And so that can be extremely helpful in the use cases that Kevin showed, where you might have Kevin uses the model I generate to make a website, the monarchinitiative.org, right? He's using the same classes that we've defined from a subject matter level expertise to make a website that shows the relationship between phenotypes and disease, and genes and phenotypes.
Okay, and so as a fairly naive user, when you say class, should I think predefined data structures?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great way to say it. Yeah, absolutely.
I decided that the 100-degree heat was favorable to the noise. That the way you think of it is, you sort of use the class to be able to sort of make pass each of your instances through, a sort of validation step. And it's not the same as the validator, but it can be nice to get that sort of one at a time effect of passing it through the classes. I think, and that's a reason why sort of my like unfamiliarity with Gen project is that the BioLink model is sort of where the Gen project happens for me, and then I just get to do a Python import, and I sort of pick my version, and then I'm not generating the Pydantic locally in my project. It's sort of happening upstream.
Okay, thanks.
Maybe another tiny question. So like, I see in the schedule we'll have about 30 minutes at the end to talk about like our own use cases and what should be done. Okay, I'm looking forward to this thing. Because you gave the Monarch initiative example, and like they've been working on Phenopacket and things, and we do stuff with Phenopacket. So like, yeah.
Awesome. No, that would be great. It would be great to get your guys' feedback and to really do some use cases that are important to you. Because I think that the tooling is there. It just depends on what you want to use it for.
Yeah. That's good. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I'll say again too that like there are sort of levels of detail that you need here, and it depends on your level of expertise, right? So when you're using the cookie cutter like we did at the beginning, you get a lot of this stuff for free and you can just ignore it, right? But if you want to get into customizing your outputs for your use cases, that's when some of these tools that are in the slides become handy. So right, by default, we don't generate Pydantic classes from LinkML. If you use the tutorial, what you're going to get is Python data classes, right? Have a fast API implementation, right? You're making an API that uses your model. You really want that Pydantic model so that it just seamlessly flows into your code base. That's where you start using things like Gen project or that config file that we showed. Same with the linter, right? If you want to get more functionality out of the toolkit, you can customize it. But out of the box, really, you're going to get a lot of the way there in terms of sharing your model with your entire staff or with other people from just writing in the YAML itself. And I think the other thing that we tried to show in those slides was that like, it depends on your use case, what serializations you actually need. If I want to throw up BioLink model to something where biologists know where to find it, ontology lookup service, I'm going to serialize BioLink model as OWL. It has a direct path into ontology lookup service. If, something like the Alliance of Genome Resources, where they're really concerned about ingesting data according to a schema without doing a lot of data wrangling on top of that data, they want to have a really good contract between the person who's submitting data to that resource and their schema. So they're going to make JSON schema out of their LinkML model. And they're going to stick that JSON schema right in the middle. Anything that comes into that JSON schema has to be validated, which Patrick is going to get to in just a second here, with the JSON schema representation of their LinkML model. And then on their other side, they're going to have a SQL database. And that SQL database's data definition language is going to be conformant to this LinkML model, right? And so they can switch out backends. They can say, you know what, I don't like SQL anymore. I want to use Neo4j. I don't have to rewrite my entire schema. I already have it in LinkML. LinkML can produce, nodes and edges, just like it can produce tables and columns. So it really decouples the technology from your meta model, for lack of a better word. Monarch might do it on the opposite side. They're not so concerned about people submitting data to their system in a rigorous way because they're doing that all themselves. They're an aggregator. They're pulling it in. They're writing the definition for, bringing in this data. But on the other side, they want, their downstream developers to develop according to this subject matter expertise. And so they might generate the TypeScript model in, JavaScript or whatever to show to the user. So the whole point of that Gen project, Gen LinkML, Gen this, Gen that, is to be able to fit into a existing technical stack without changing the definitions of your classes and slots. The easiest way to see that is in the documentation, or the easiest way to see that in the concept of that is in the documentation, because it's kind of already deploying for you. It's kind of already showing up on GitHub. It is changing from YAML into Markdown, so you can see that there's like kind of some code going on in the background to make those Markdown files for you. But you kind of have to customize it to your use case.
I find it interesting what you just like within the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. There's a lot of discussions right now as to like how to model schemas, and there's even a study group looking at what would be the recommended way to publish your own schemas, and so there's a phenopacket which is originally provided as protobuf object, and then many people don't use Java and they don't do protobuf, and then they start working on their JSON schema, and then you need shims between and this is a hot topic right now. Like, what do we require people to express their schemas as to make it like intercompatible, at least between work stream within Global Alliance and those things. So like, yeah.
Absolutely. That's exactly, I mean, it's so common, right? If you're talking about a use case where, you want to switch out the backend because somehow, Neo4j is no longer performant. And so you want to put SQL in there or something, or vice versa. And the technical cost of that is so great, or the code you have to write to be able to convert between some of these technical implementations is so great that you just stop. And so you have an outdated model, right, that might not be applicable to the more recent developers that you've hired because you're stuck in protobuf, or you're stuck in SQL, or you're stuck here. You want to be able to take all that knowledge that you made to make the language you're using to talk amongst the layers of your project. You want to keep that domain model, but just be able to put it in a different technology. And so that's sort of what LinkML is trying to do. There's, of course, other tools like this out in the world. Ours is sort of like written in the biological space to begin with, so we know how important like ontologies are, and OWL is, and the semantic web, and all of that stuff. So I feel like that's where LinkML tries to sit, exactly those use cases. And there's nothing preventing you from writing your entire LinkML model in JSON schema. We kind of briefly touched this in the beginning, that there are tools in LinkML like Schema Automator that takes a JSON schema. And I think I did this for GA4GH once in your VRL. I think that's the name of it. There's a sub schema that you have, and I took the JSON schema, I ran it through Schema Automator, and it spat out LinkML YAML, right? So that me as a LinkML developer, I can see where your JSON schema is going in my own frame of reference. But you don't necessarily have to like teach everyone who's just learned JSON schema how to do LinkML YAML. You as a technologist can do that conversion for them, keep it in YAML, maybe then translate it into OWL or wherever else you want to go with it too. So it's a nice feature. Did we suck up all the break, Patrick? Should we move on here, or does people actually want to get a glass of coffee or go to the bathroom?
Yeah, we can. This validation part shouldn't take too long, so we can just probably continue on if I can figure out where my slides went. There we go. Okay, sharing screen. Here we go. Okay, so this is our last like formal section here, validating data. So the sort of the motivating like scenario here is like continuing on with our like original samples schema. Let's say like a soil researcher has produced data that they want to submit to us. And so what we want to do is verify that their data conforms to our schema before we accept that, whatever that means. Accepting means we put it in a database. Accepting means, whatever. We just, so we'll keep that intentionally vague, and but just starting with like the most basic like way you could do this is using the LinkML validate command line tool. So this is it's a configurable like utility for validating data instances against a schema. And so kind of at a bare minimum, you tell this command, here's the schema file that that defines like the classes I want to validate against, and then some source of data, which is usually going to be a file in various formats. There's a link to the documentation here, but we'll just do a quick example. So let's imagine that somebody's provided a single instance of the soil sample class in a YAML file. So I'm going to, no, there it is. I'm going to make a new file called soil sample.yaml. I'm just going to stick it in this source data examples directory. And here's the content. So ID, latitude, longitude. This should all look familiar based on like the schema that we've written. And so with that, I can run this command. So LinkML validate. The schema pointing to that, to our YAML file. The target class, I'm telling it, there's a number of classes in our schema, and I'm telling it, you should interpret this data as an instance of the soil sample class. And then I'm giving it a path to this file. And if I run that, hey, no issues found. So that's
Patrick. I don't think you're sharing your screen right now. We see the slide. But,
Are you seeing the slide, or are you seeing?
I see your IDE.
Oh.
then,
Maybe David can try refreshing.
Yeah, you might have to refresh. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Okay. So this is good. So it told us that this is what should be considered to be a valid soil sample. So that's nice. Now, if we wanted to, we could try updating this sample. It's because we want to see this thing like catch up problem. So the sample biome slot in our schema, if I find it here, sample biome, the range of this slot is this biome type enum, and this biotype enum permits certain values. And so if I were to change sample type biome from desert to, say, my backyard, it should tell me about this, because backyard is not one of these permissible values. So let's see what happens in this case. So I've updated my example data, and I run this again. And you can see it's saying there's an issue. And so just kind of breaking this down a little bit, error is, so we have some kind of indication of severity here. This could be an error, a warning, just sort of informational, depending on the details. The next part is kind of telling you where this data instance came from. So there's this is the path to the example file we gave it. I'll talk about this /0 in just a second. The last part of this, where it says in/sample biome, is giving an indication of where within the data instance the problem is. So basically in the sample biome slot, or the field, however you want to refer to it. And then this last part is the details on the exact issue, and it's telling you pretty clearly in this case that backyard is not one of the permissible values. I think I've got this, listed out on the slides here. So again, severity, where the thing came from, a pointer to within the instance to where the problem is, and then a detailed description of the problem. Okay, let's expand on our example. So the LinkML validate command knows how to handle multiple instances in one file. If you're using a YAML format, you could separate these two instances as what's called multiple documents within a YAML file, separated by this triple dash thing. So let's try that out. Okay, so now I've got two instances of soil sample that I want to validate. And I'm going to change this back to I think it was desert before. Okay, so we'll get rid of that issue. I'll run this again, and it's going to tell me that there were no issues found. Now, if you were, yeah, okay, right. I ran this command, no issues found. Although if you were really looking at this closely, this maybe would have caught your eye. This is a latitude that is like, I don't know, off the planet somewhere. So latitude should be between -90 and 90, and we gave it 123. And so that's perhaps a problem. So that kind of indicates like a deficiency in our model. We didn't specify in our model that that latitude needs to be between -90 and 90. So this is the definition of our latitude slot as it exists right now. And if you kind of poke through the LinkML modeling documentation a little bit, you might find that there are meta model constructs, minimum value and maximum value. So we could use those to our advantage here. Let's go back over to our IDE and add those. So we'll locate our latitude slot, and we'll say minimum value, -90. Oops. Maximum value, 90. And now if I run the LinkML validate command again, I'm hoping it catches that error that I would have expected. And indeed it does. So it says, so yeah, there's an error in this file. And now maybe this /1 makes more sense. This is the sort of the index to within the file. So this is this example, or this instance would be the sort of the 0 index 1. This would be the index 1 instance. And so the problems with the first 0-based soil sample here, and it's telling me that this is greater than the maximum of 90 in the latitude slot. So yeah, so this is narrowing it down for me pretty well. What the problem with this data is. And so this is kind of so you could see this as an aid to schema development if you wanted to. So there's one sort of use case of LinkML validate where you're saying somebody from the outside world is giving me data, and I want to see if that data conforms to my schema, and I can give them a yes or no answer on that. But also, like, maybe I'm coming up with sort of artificial examples just to exercise my schema and see if it's validating things that I would, validating data in the way I would expect it to. The way we found out that we were missing minimum value and maximum value here. So, so some people sometimes think of validation as an aid for schema development. And so there's another command line utility that kind of formalizes this a little bit, if you will. And that's this LinkML run examples command. And so what the gist of what this is what this command expects is for you to point it to a directory of examples that you expect to validate correctly according to your schema, and then point it to sort of a directory of counter examples that you say, I expect these to not pass validation. And so that can be, if you have a testing process for your schema, this can be hooked into the testing process. And it's just a way to make sure that your schema doesn't, drift away from like these important use cases that you've defined via example files. So what I could do is say in my examples directory, I actually split out that one file into two separate files and put them into an invalid directory, so I can put that soil sample with the latitude that's too high, put that in one file under this invalid directory. I could keep the original correct soil sample in this valid directory. And then this command is rather lengthy, but LinkML run examples, tell it the invalid directory is the counter example input directory. The valid directory is the input directory. It's going to produce a bunch of output, so I need to tell it where to put that, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not going to go through all that right now because it'll just be shuffling files around. And I will also point out that there's a target called test examples in the make file that kind of is a little bit of a shortcut for running that command. So yeah, so some people like that model, and then we're not going to go through that in this workshop, but if you want to go further with validation, you can access the same kind of underlying features that the LinkML validate command line utility uses. You can use that in Python code if that is, if that works for your particular project. Maybe you have a bunch of Python code already written and you want to sort of integrate a LinkML validation step into that Python code. You can do that. And then if you want to stick with the CLI, and configure it to use different validation strategies, et cetera. There's a whole host of configuration you can do that we can't get into here. But if you take a look at this documentation page, this walks through sort of using this in Python code. Talks about more advanced features of the command line interface. And I think that's it. So I think we're just basically at the kind of end where we can kind of just do a little free-form discussion and that sort of thing. So I'll stop sharing. Maybe. Yeah. Okay. There we go.
That was great. I think validation is actually really helpful for supporting the use case where you want LinkML to be sort of like or your data model in general, even if you don't want to do LinkML, you want it to be sort of a substrate for collaboration. Oftentimes you have people with different skill levels there. So if you're trying to train an entire component of your project to use a schema language, you want to have those example data in there so that you can see as a subject matter expert, software developer, what I'm actually talking about when I say something is required. Like it's not unexpected to have people of many different skill levels trying to contribute to that model. So we try to do examples forward design of our schemas. Okay, that's a lot of us talking. So how can we help? What can we go into deeper?
Is it acceptable to request a 5 minutes break now?
Absolutely, we can take a 5-minute break. Absolutely, let's come back at 2:10. That's 6 minutes. All right, 2:10. Right, so again, we kind of have a large community of open source developers. We do have monthly meetings. Those are perfect opportunities to come and ask questions, get direct access to the developers of this toolkit, present your work, that question that we had at the beginning about what other models are using LinkML. Am I working in the same domain as someone else? It's a great place to do it. If you click on this link, you can join our Slack space. Again, offline connection with developers, other people in the community. And, there's plenty of ways to connect. So just get in touch. Mailing list, Mastodon, LinkedIn. We've got it covered. Don't you worry. You might run into Nomi Harris, who's the coordinator for BOSC. She's also on our team, and she's a great community manager. So say hi if you see her at the conference next week or in a couple weeks. And then please fill out this survey. It's linked in the doc or in the slides. I'll also put it in the chat. I think that's for ISMB. And we'd appreciate your feedback, of course. And then I'll just stop talking. And are there questions or things that we can go into further that would help? If not, that's totally okay. We can end a little early.
Yeah, I know that there's just so many things that in the ecosystem that we could talk about, and so it's kind of a challenge for us to balance just giving a little taste of everything versus going deep into certain things. And so if you have questions, if you want to try to get started using LinkML tools and you're just still a little unsure of where to get started, this is a great time to ask that kind of thing.
Well, one thing you mentioned early on, or not early on, but about halfway through, you made an example, Sierra, of you said, oh, you could take an abstract and turn that into a schema. And I was like, oh, I'm not sure I know what that means. But I can tell you, I'm here because LinkML sounds like a systematic way to describe data and then link it to many, many things. I come at this as a biologist who likes to compute things, and I've been doing genomics for 25 years now. And I've always been surrounded by data, and I've always been wanting to describe it as systematically as possible. And I've run into Chris at various conferences and, ontology stuff from 20 years ago. And all the stuff that tends to come at me is really, really obtuse and obscure. And I'm trying to make it real for biologists, right? And so, but over the years, I have analyzed hundreds, if not thousands of projects. And I systematically describe to my own satisfaction with YAML quite often the work that I do. So I have data sets that I can describe. I have the reports and the analysis that I do about them that's systematic, and then how they connect to other things. And so I think LinkML can probably be used to make connections between all those things if they were all just described properly. Anyway, but then you mentioned abstracts as schemas, and I was like, ooh, that's interesting too.
That's fantastic. I feel like you're exactly the demographic that we were hoping would have come to this tutorial, because there is a lot of subject matter expertise that's in the weed with lots of technology overload. And I think that maybe we did a little technology overload in this one too, but lessons learned. But I think that if you're a subject matter expert and you already can write YAML, LinkML is a great way for you to contribute your expertise to a computable standard that someone with more technical skills or yourself can just take and then apply in different ways to different applications. And so, what we've found is that oftentimes, so I work on, the Alliance of Genome Resource, National Microbiome Data Collaborative, BioLink, and CATS Translator. What we find is that there's a role for someone who is a LinkML expert to come in and say, these are the classes and slots, this is how you do it. And in about 2 or 3 of these tutorials, a subject matter expert can say, I get it. And then they take it up, they write complex descriptions, they write complex interrelationships between those classes and slots. They understand more deeply than I do how to apply an ontology to their data. And so it's almost like we can turn over the keys to the people that actually understand data from, collecting it. And we can sit back and say, and you've produced us something that I can compute. I don't have to ask you again about this spreadsheet header. I don't have to ask you again. And you don't have to be annoyed with me for not understanding what you mean, because you've written in the description, you've given me metadata on my data. So I'm glad you spoke up, because I'm glad that someone said this is actually something that's on your radar. Because yeah, it can be hard to know, how to convey that message to people.
Great.
I think an interesting development of LinkML 2 has been that the semantic web community in Europe has really grabbed onto this technology. And so we had a presenter at our community meeting last month from as a representative of electric grid operators from the UK and from Belgium, coming together on a data standard to represent grid operations in LinkML, right? So we are from a biological background, but LinkML is very generic language. So just like JSON schema, you can apply it to a lot of different stacks. The relevance here for this conversation is that, biology is complex. You might just be focusing on this very tiny slice of biology, but if it's in LinkML, you can connect it to BioLink, which has, maybe your clinical components, or you can connect it to Natural Microbiome Data Collaborative. And suddenly you have a microbiome sample from a human gut that can be related to the microbiome sample from, I don't know, the soil with where it was collected. So,
Yeah.
Can I ask, do you see the LinkML standard, like the YAML format, ever being a sort of a target as a data model, or do you always see it as something that's going to be transpiled into RDF, Pydantic? Like, do you always see yourself as this authorship format for other things, or would you like it to be a standard all its own?
I mean, I guess I can start maybe, and Sierra, maybe you can correct me where I'm wrong. But I think that the original vision of LinkML was as a bit of a a Swiss Army knife, sort of like in that it's kind of the central source of truth, but then a lot of the quote unquote real work happens using Artifact, and you sort of like leverage existing technologies by being sort of a more abstract sort of definition language or definition layer. So that really was kind of the original vision. And increasingly, I think, especially even in the validation realm, we're starting to see the limitations of that, because under the hood, not that this is matters for most people in day-to-day usage, but under the hood, LinkML Validate is highly leveraging JSON schema validation. So you could kind of think of it as just like a wrapper around, take my schema, generate JSON schema from it, apply that JSON schema to whatever data is coming in. It's not exactly that simple, but like you could imagine it that way. We are kind of seeing in certain projects that have very complex LinkML schemas, we're kind of starting to see the drawbacks of that approach, right? The approach of, just generate some existing standard and utilize existing tools. It gets you pretty far, pretty fast, which is nice because you're leveraging a lot of other people's great work. But there are limitations. And so we're starting to see that. And so we are kind of thinking about implementing a LinkML like native validation tool where there's sort of no transpiling going on, no generating other artifacts. It's just operating on the LinkML schema. It's working on that with like a focused effort is a little dependent on getting people's time and
It's a lot of
focus, which kind of
that
equates to money, but it's definitely something we're thinking about.
Okay.
One question: would you say that adopting LinkML to start expressing our schemas and can facilitate into the semantic web. Like, say we're starting to publish more of that data openly, and then like we've had like a semantic web and they're posting under our radar as important things to watch, but like we just don't have time to dedicate to do these things. So like even that you're saying you write, well, I think Sarah, you were talking about that. Like, you write your LinkML schema and you have all of these conversion tools to have your JSON schema and have like your RDF like documents and those things. So like this kind of like an easier entry step to that other world that we haven't.
That is exactly our hope.
Mhm.
Chris, yeah, all of you know Chris Mungo. Like he's clearly very fluent in the semantic web, and what he's said to us over time, and Patrick and Kevin and I have sort of entered into his world right in the last 10 years, but it's hard for people who are technologists to necessarily get the skills they need to be proficient in the semantic web. It's just a little bit harder. We're not trained for that when we come out of school necessarily. And, we could talk about forever how that's a problem because we love the semantic web and this should be the foundation and come on. But if you ask a bunch of developers, do they know SQL, select statements, or do they know Sparkle? I bet you would say SQL most of the time. And that's not great or bad or whatever. It just is what it is. Do you know JSON schema or do you know YAML? You probably know JSON schema now. So, but we don't want things like ID maintenance and stable URIs to be lost because those are so critically important to us being able to reuse data in the biological sciences. So what LinkML tries to do is hide those things in a syntax that is more familiar to object-oriented programmers, in a syntax that's approachable for users that don't necessarily know any technology. YAML, we didn't go into this at all in the tutorial, but we do have tools that take like spreadsheets and turn them into LinkML, right? So we know where our users are. They're in this very like flat table world, and we want them to add URIs. We want them to add identifiers. We want them to use semantic web components. We want to reuse ontologies. We want to model in object relational models, right? Like we want to do that. We just need to help people from where they are to where they're going. So I don't think, this is trying to replace RDF. It's not trying to replace JSON schema. It's not trying to replace anything. It's just sort of trying to be a bridge. How successful that is, I think we have one particular flagship project that is trying very hard to make their source of truth technology RDF, right? So they're trying to work in a graph. They're trying to, use the OWL representation of their LinkML model to do validation and to do exploration. And, I think that's a really good use case. I think more often our other flagships tend to use the ones that the developers, know better. JSON schema, you might use SQL, things like that. So if you have an RDF use case, we'd love to have you come to the LinkML community meeting. I think in August, Chris is going to do a full hour on the relationship between LinkML and the semantic web. So I think that'll be a really good place to come and see it and, develop from there.
I have a couple more, but I want to let others have a chance to. So.
Actually, I have one question. So I work for a company that develops a workflow engine, and we're sort of for computational workflows, and we're sort of thinking about extending the sort of output schema for these workflows, or like the way outputs are defined. And I think like an interesting use case for this sort of tech would be obviously annotating those outputs with like if we were to choose a technology to from your expertise, like should RDF as one of the targets for LinkML be what we should be building on in its like perfect case, or does it not matter? Like, or does it just depend? It might be a complicated answer. Okay. Like we're not like to make it programming language agnostic, but apart from that, Like, do you have any recommendations on which LinkML target we should be thinking about first?
Well, can I ask you a question? Like, who are the primary users of your software stack?
Bioinformaticians, computational biologists.
Computational biologists. Yeah, So you're going to hear my bias, and maybe Chris would answer this differently, but I would say probably RDF is not your target, right? A bioinformatician maybe isn't necessarily trained in RDF as much as they're trained in just Perl or Python, right? Like something a little bit more approachable. But take that with a grain of salt, right? Like I don't know your user base, and so I guess maybe my answer would be it depends. Where is your user base most comfortable? If it's RDF, then of course use it. So, and maybe I don't know, Patrick, Kevin, do you guys have different opinions? It could be that I'm just off on a tangent here.
No, I think it really just depends on so many factors about how your project is configured, both in like a technical and in a social way. You know, I know some projects where like it's all like the schema is really way far in the background, and you only sort of rely on like interfaces like web APIs to like, you know, to import or export data, in which case, you know, what artifacts you generate from the LinkML schema is sort of irrelevant because it's always kind of hidden behind this API layer. So if that's the situation that you're facing, then it's just kind of like, well, it's just technical. It's just a technical like implementation detail about what artifacts you care to generate from your LinkML model. Versus other types of projects where the schema is like right out there, like right front and center, and you really publish it and you really try to socialize it with users, and then maybe your decision is more based on what those users are familiar with. So it's a really hard question to answer.
Yeah, I suspect that might have been the case, but I wanted to ask it anyway. It give me lots of food for thought.
Yeah.
You should go, David.
So in the example that you pasted in the chat, Sierra, one is specifically talking about the Pheno packets, like the linkml.io / so there's an example saying how to index Pheno packets with LinkML store. So LinkML store is I guess it's an engine with a backend, a relational database backend to just like eat LinkML objects. And
yeah, I'm glad you looked for it. LinkML store is another beta project that we're working on. So just the same thing, we're trying to remove the technology choice as a blocker for making a domain model. We're also trying to remove the choice of technology from being a storage blocker for making your model. So I don't know if I'm describing that correctly, but LinkML store is kind of like an interface between, you know, Solr as a backend, or a relational database like DuckDB as a backend, or, you know, any other number of backends that you could choose there. And you know, I probably wouldn't say I'm an expert in LinkML store. Chris is just developing that now. So I probably could answer some questions about it, but I'm definitely not an expert. I don't know. Kevin, did you have more experience with LinkML store through Solr?
I'm not using it yet for my stack, and it's sort of, I think there's some things that will like need to move around and some like work to do. So I'm generating the two sort of relevant data sources. You know, I'm making a SQLite and also actually a DuckDB database. Making tables out of my graph, like nodes and edges, and then also I'm putting all that into Solr. And I'm using a tool called LinkML Solr that I think you know, Chris wrote in like 4 hours while he was like doing, you know, at a meeting or something. I don't know that that I've sort of like been maintaining since. That I think I might be the only user of it. But what it does is takes a LinkML schema and turns that into a Solr schema, and then it also has the like functionality to load my TSV file in and make a bunch of Solar documents out of it. And I think that repository should go away. And within LinkML, there should be like a gen Solar that will just make the schema document that needs to get sort of uploaded or whatever, or you know, yeah, I think make this sort of schema JSON that gets pushed up to configure, and then LinkML store would be the thing that that then I would use to like bulk upload the documents or sort of bring them down and sort of query for them in like a standard way, and then I'd be able to sort of like have either backend, have like a database backend or a Solar backend or a Neo4j backend, and I should be able to say, get me the node with this gene ID or whatever, and from any of them sort of independently.
Thank you for that. I have another one, maybe too stupid, but like, so I guess in the end, what I understand is that there's no such way, no such thing as saying my data is expressed in LinkML, right? LinkML is just we define your schema, and then it generates schemas in whatever language you want. Like you don't validate your data with LinkML, you validate it with the schema that was generated out of what you said to LinkML to prepare in one format or another. Okay.
Yeah, that's a fair way to think about it.
Yeah, you can validate your model against LinkML schema as a schema. So this is the fun thing about LinkML, that your schema is data that follows the LinkML meta model. You know, so you can validate that data against that model, but then downstream of that, you have your data, which is then validated against your schema as a schema.
It sometimes takes people a long time to wrap their heads around that.
I hear a lot, like people well, a lot. I mean, I've heard a couple of times people talking about LinkML. Like, how about we express? Should we express like? I was talking about G4GH. Like, should we express this as a JSON schema? Should we go like should we express this as LinkML? Okay, well, I understand it. There's no such thing. It's just like it. Yeah.
Yeah, LinkML just has a meta model that sort of wraps up the kinds of things you want to see in schema in its own syntax. And then those are converted to JSON schema if you want, or OWL or whatever. There are, as we said before, though, there are components of the LinkML meta model that aren't representable in, you know, different kinds of our serializations. Class URI, again, very important for RDF, not so important for SQL. Or if it is, it's just another column, right, in the table definition. So, you know, when you're talking about whether we should author it in LinkML or author it in JSON schema, you can author it in LinkML, and you can still use the tools you already have that work with JSON schema with the JSON schema serialization of your LinkML model. And what you get on top of that is the ability to do more stuff with it than JSON schema can. So if you want to make an OWL version of it, you can. As far as I know, there's no JSON schema to OWL, you know, path. Although now that I say that, I'm sure somebody has written one.
This sort of problem feels like an inevitability when these projects where you have, oh, I'd like to express a set of, like a union of all of these features, and then no single target accepts all those features, and then suddenly it becomes extremely tempting to, why don't we just make our thing the standard? Like, I feel like it's no getting around that. Like, that temptation will always be there, and it's like, it'll be an expression of humility in the project to always think of yourself as the authorship target, but I understand the temptation might be too great.
Totally agree with you. We have this really great slide that we always put up, and I didn't put it in this slide deck, but it's that XKCD one where
yeah, there are 14 repeating standards.
Why don't we make another one? And it's totally true, and it's totally reasonable. And believe me, I wrote a lot of SQL and a lot of JSON schema before I found LinkML, and I can see why especially if you just have something simple and you're already familiar with the technology, why do I need to learn LinkML? And the answer, my answer is always, I don't know, but it's really easy once you learn it. And I've applied it many different places. And so I feel like I've been converted. So that's my job is now to convert you. But good point. There is always another new thing to come along. I think when we were starting LinkML, we also ran into a project called Schema Salad, which is like, if I'm remembering correctly, it's very similar to LinkML, except it's for workflow management. Maybe you know it better than I do, but it's documenting a workflow from X to Z, through a bunch of steps, and you specify that in YAML, and then you can convert it to this and that. Blah, 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 blah. So very similar.
It's the CWL project, I think.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would just maybe tack on to the question about like Sarah's point about like, why another thing, like why another thing. I think the main things we try to emphasize with LinkML is just that it maybe is more approachable for anybody than writing these other things directly, right? Writing JSON schema directly or whatever. So maybe it helps democratize your schema development a little bit. You can get more people involved in the process if that's useful to you. And then perhaps from a technical side, maybe it helps avoid a bit of like the vendor lock-in effect. You maybe start with a SQL database now, and you utilize the LinkML's DDL generator today, and maybe tomorrow you want to use a graph database and you start using the RDF generator tomorrow. You can do that without maybe a tremendous amount of conversion headache. So you're not necessarily locked into one thing.
That's a compelling argument, I think.
Chris, do you have one more, or do I'll go to my next one? Okay. So I just want to elaborate a little bit more on the things about GA4GH I was mentioning before. So like I'm sorry, I'm getting a bit of feedback. 1 second. Okay. So like I'm part of a couple of groups. Fino Packets is being one of them. Basically aiming to write a schema on how to store clinical data on an individual, their biosamples, and those things. And so I have a side group that's also working on what Phenopacket doesn't look at, which is like a storing experiments metadata, like a like you run a sequencing experiment on whatever, like whether it's a human sample or a little shovel of dirt to do like metagenomics or those things. Like anyway, it's an experiment on a sequencer. Okay, so like we're working on right now. We're just working on a checklist. Like, what are the relevant properties to capture to properly characterize a genomic experiment in a broad sense, and then we look into like going. By composition building these kinds of modules where like if it's a transcriptomic experiment, there's another a subset of properties that are relevant, and then so like but right now we said we're like half of the discussions were around what should be in that list, and the other half were people saying, but how do we express it? And then we decided to shovel that to later, and hopefully to another subgroup that will look at this. And actually, there's this other study group that I mentioned earlier called Damask that's looking at these considerations right now. So I just wanted to express like they will most likely be interested in that group to what you guys are doing, and if you're interested, I could put you in touch with the lead of that study group, and maybe we could arrange something that that might help to convince a couple of people.
We would love that opportunity, especially to tailor the presentation to your use case, because quite frankly, there's like a couple of different efforts going on that sound similar to that, just from us, knowing about a lot of projects that use LinkML in terms of modeling an experiment, modeling, sometimes we call it a sample, but how a particular thing moves through different analyses and analysis pipelines. So that's the second link I posted in the chat, CMDR. And then the first link I posted was, Chris's attempt to convert phenopackets to LinkML. So both of those things on both sides of the spectrum, we are definitely, assembling experts that, in biology, and also trying to make, LinkML the substrate with which to talk about those things. So it would be wonderful to be able to meet people and just sort of tailor a presentation around that. Yeah. Are you already on our Slack channel, David?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
I should though.
Or if you don't want to, here, I'll put my email in the chat, and you can just email me and I'll pass it on. Or if you want to reach out to Patrick I think, Patrick, you have your email address handy too, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat there. And we're also very active on Slack. I mean, the whole LinkML community is very active on Slack, and that was linked in one of the presentation slides. But yeah, there's the OBO community Slack has some LinkML channels. So one that's geared more towards just the broader community, and one that's more geared towards like developers. So those would be great to join. And then once you're part of that OBO community Slack, you could like private message like either of us. That's totally fine. Just volunteering Sierra for that.
So, like in the use case I described, like like maybe I'll dive a little bit more in the concepts we're looking at. So, I have an experiment, a sequencing experiment, okay, and then there's a set of properties that describe this experiment. There's an instrument, and there's a molecule you're looking at, and there's different things, and then if I'm doing a transcriptomic experiment, there might be an additional set of properties that are relevant to transcriptomic. And then if I'm doing single cell experiments, then there might be another set of properties about single cell. So is there, I need to wrap my mind more around what we've seen today, and another thing like that. Is there a way to express this in LinkML, like this kind of composition concept that there's a core, and then basically you can kind of choose tags that are relevant to what you're doing, and this adds things to your own case.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's sort of two ways out of the box to do that. And one is sort of through this ISMB method, right? So I'm trying to find an example that would work here, but like if you had a gas chromatography experiment and some more specific gas chromatography experiment was also required. I'm not an expert at gas chromatography, but you had some sort of like sub process of that. You could extend the gas why did I pick this example? You could extend that class and add additional attributes based on a more specific kind of gas chromatography, right? That's a simple way to do it. You can just extend a class. The other way to do it, there's a couple more ways. LinkML has a construct called subset, right? And so in that subset tag, you can say, these are the classes in my bigger model that represent this gas chromatography subset. So I'm saying this subset of my model has to do with this kind of an experiment. Or even further to the point, if you look at some of our bigger schemas, in our example, right, we only have one YAML file here. And it's the YAML file that has all of our classes. But what people tend to do is break up that YAML file into several different YAML files. And LinkML knows how to handle several different YAML files. And they either do it by domain or they do it by construct. So they might say all the classes go in this YAML file, all the enums go in this YAML file. But they also do it by domain. So you could have a YAML file in your bigger LinkML model that is like genome experiments, PCR, I don't know, something like that. And another YAML file, you have all of your gas chromatography. And what that modularization means that someone comes along and says, I only want to talk to you about gas chromatography. They look in one place, or they import just that YAML file into their model and extend it, right? So I briefly showed a tool called LinkML Map, where I was kind of trying to make the point that you could take latitude and longitude and turn it into a GPS slot. But the other thing LinkML Map does, or is intended to do, is take a really big schema, something like BioLink, which covers, like I said, the range from genomics to clinical clinicians. It's huge. And it lets you subset that model into, please just give me, these classes and these slots and their parents. Give me just this slice. So I guess in summary, you have ways to extend a class hierarchy with the ISA construct. You have ways to subset a particular schema, either with that meta model component subset, or dividing your model into several different YAML files that are imported together and merged together with LinkML. Or through LinkML Map, you have the other end of that spectrum, which is, I already have a model, please subset it for me, and I just want this little slice of it. So all those things are valid use cases. They're probably slightly different than what you're asking, but I think you could get there with some of those common practices. In particular, the ISA, making a subclass, making a parent class, making, grouping together like components and then adding additional components to a child of that liked component class. Does that make sense? Sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, I'm surrounded by all different kinds of technologies, and so I kind of assume each one will have its own schema, even though the samples that go into them have kind of more commonality, I guess, perhaps.
I think my Juno is stuck at the moment, so I had a little hard time hearing that, but maybe Patrick could respond. I tried to share my screen again. Bad idea.
No, I don't think it was just you. I also didn't catch it.
Okay.
Unfortunately. Sorry.
Oh, can you hear me now at all?
Now, yeah.
Yeah, I was just saying that I'm surrounded by technologies. So we have single cell experiments, we have sequencing experiments, we have proteomics experiments, we have microscopy experiments, but they're all around projects. And so I work at an institute where we just generate information en masse about all these things. And I'd like to describe each technology systematically, of course, but then link them all together around experiments, and experiments are done on samples. So I was kind of assuming that you would have your own YAML file for any given kind of technology, etc.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I was trying to say. You basically summarized it. You can model even the metadata around how you make an experiment. And that's a good communication tool for talking about how your organization works. Yeah, I agree.
Any work you're aware of on the provenance metadata at the level of
Well, we're really good friends with Matt Brush. So he's definitely our expert in provenance. I'd say that most of our flagship projects use provenance a little bit differently. I'd say BioLink has done the sort of most that I know of to do model provenance, but I don't think it's at all complete in terms of that. I think a lot of times we're motivated by end use cases, which is the user saying, I want to know the publication this was in. So that's sort of like where provenance kind of goes to die, right? Because there's lots more metadata around provenance than just which pub it's in. Pub is extremely important, the most important. But there's also like, what kind of a resource was this? Is it a curated resource? Did I aggregate this together? Is it moving through some sort of ETL pipeline, right? Am I transforming the data to match a new model? There's a whole bunch of provenance there. And I think there's still work to do.
I guess in a implementation sense, that like you'd be sort of defining your schema and you'd have those provenance fields, and then you would want to like exact match your provenance fields to some provenance ontology that is going to sort of, so that it means, you can define
This is like kind of, well, pitching what we're doing in G4GH as well one more time, but like it's kind of a new topic there. But like we on our group with our projects knows that I've been talking about this for a while, like publications, but more than that, like what's inside of the data set. Is it about a cohort somewhere in Canada with how many participants, which time frame, and for what reason, and those, and like there are we've met some models that describe things a little bit, but like they're far from being complete, and they're it really only scratches the surface, and like yeah, basically we're looking for a way to express these in a way that's compatible with what others are doing. So I guess need to start working on that LinkML.
Yeah, and check out BioLink. You might find some of that stuff helpful. If not, we should improve it. But
BioLink,
right,
okay,
BioLink,
I'll have a look.
BioLink.github.io. All right, we're getting towards the end here. We have about 8 minutes left. I want to give you guys time to respond to the survey, just because we want you to be able to give us good feedback. Are there any other sort of last minute questions that we can answer before we call it an evening?
Any of you guys will be at ISMB?
I'll see you there, David. Come by the Secura booth, David. I'll see you there.
Sounds good.
David and I were colleagues at McGill.
Excellent. Excellent. We'll be virtual attendees this year. I was there in Lyon last year, but not this year. Not another French ISMB for me.
So, yeah, then I guess we'll continue the conversations virtually.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you all for attending. I know it was a small group, and I'm glad we were able to see you guys. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.